Ever wonder why entire societies can be steered like flocks of birds? Tonight, uncover the hidden psychological warfare tactics designed to manipulate crowds, sway opinions, and quietly control the masses, so you can drift to sleep knowing the forces that shape our collective minds. The consensus mirage technique. Imagine living in a world where the truth is not determined by facts or evidence, but by the overwhelming illusion of agreement, where the mere perception of consensus is weaponized, forcing individuals to abandon their own thoughts, doubts, and beliefs, not because they have been convinced through reason, but because they fear isolation, rejection, or exile from what seems to be an unbreakable collective majority. This is the terrifying power of what we might call the consensus mirage technique. At its core, the consensus mirage technique is the deliberate fabrication of a majority opinion, a carefully constructed narrative that is broadcast relentlessly, across every channel, platform, and social circle, until it saturates the environment. This manufactured unanimity creates a psychological pressure cooker, where the need to belong outweighs the courage to dissent. The overwhelming noise of agreement drowns out individual voices, planting a seed of doubt in anyone who might question the narrative. Am I the only one who thinks differently? They wonder. And in that moment of uncertainty, many surrender their own views, opting instead for the apparent safety of conformity. This phenomenon is not new. History is littered with examples where fabricated or exaggerated majorities have shaped entire societies. In the 1930s, propaganda flooded Germany with messages glorifying a singular political ideology, drowning out any opposition. Citizens were made to feel as if dissent was not only futile, but dangerous. The perceived majority wasn't always real. It was a carefully cultivated mirage. People complied, sometimes against their better judgment, because the social cost of standing apart was simply too high. The psychology behind this is profound. Humans are wired for social belonging. We seek validation, community, and the safety of the group. When confronted with overwhelming consensus, even if it is false, the fear of being ostracized is so powerful that it can override critical thinking and moral conviction. This is closely related to what psychologists call pluralistic ignorance, where individuals mistakenly believe their private thoughts are out of sync with the group norm, even when many share their views privately. The result? A silent conformity to a false majority. Modern technology has only amplified this effect. Social media algorithms, designed to maximize engagement, often funnel users into echo chambers. Within these bubbles, a fabricated consensus can spread like wildfire, with dissenting opinions swiftly buried beneath waves of likes, shares, and retweets that give the illusion of overwhelming support. The collective digital applause convinces users that their views are isolated or unpopular, pushing them towards self-censorship or retreat. Consider recent political climates around the world, where narratives about candidates, policies, or social issues seem omnipresent and unanimous, only to be shattered later by surprising electoral outcomes or social movements that reveal hidden dissent. This disconnect is a direct consequence of the consensus mirage. People may feel pressured to go along with what appears dominant, yet privately harbor resistance or alternative views. The mirage creates a fragile social fabric, built more on fear of exclusion than genuine agreement. The consensus mirage technique also exploits a cognitive bias called the bandwagon effect, where individuals adopt beliefs simply because many others appear to do so. This effect can spiral, creating feedback loops that inflate the apparent size of the majority. The louder the chorus of agreement, the more people join in, sometimes without even fully understanding the content of the belief they adopt. Yet, beneath this overwhelming facade, the truth often lies in fractures and cracks, hidden pockets of resistance, suppressed questions, and whispered doubts. These undercurrents challenge the mirage, but are often silenced by social penalties: ridicule, cancel culture, professional repercussions, or worse. When the cost of dissent is high, conformity becomes a survival mechanism. What does this mean for us as individuals navigating this landscape? Awareness is the first step. Recognizing the signs of a consensus mirage, an overwhelming, too-perfect unanimity that feels more orchestrated than organic, can awaken our critical faculties. We must remind ourselves that true consensus is rare and usually messy. It involves conflict, negotiation, and the messy reality of differing opinions. Historical examples remind us that false consensus can pave the way to destructive outcomes, from mass hysteria and witch hunts to authoritarian regimes that silence opposition under the guise of unity. Conversely, breakthroughs in science, social justice, and cultural evolution have often come from those willing to stand apart, challenge the status quo, and voice unpopular truths. So, how do we resist the pull of the consensus mirage? It starts with courage, the courage to embrace uncertainty, to question even the most dominant narratives, and to seek truth beyond the crowd's roar. It means valuing authenticity over acceptance, and being willing to endure discomfort for the sake of integrity. Building spaces for genuine dialogue, where diverse perspectives are welcomed without fear of social exile, is vital. We must foster communities that prize curiosity and critical thinking over blind agreement. And as consumers of information, we should cultivate skepticism toward overwhelming majority claims, digging deeper to uncover whether a consensus is authentic or a mirage crafted for control. In an era dominated by rapid information flow and social media saturation, the consensus mirage technique represents one of the most subtle and insidious forms of influence. It preys on our deepest human needs, belonging, acceptance, and security, turning them against us to enforce silence and conformity. But the power to see through the mirage, to recognize the fabricated nature of supposed majorities, and to reclaim independent thought is a power we all possess. As we confront this modern challenge, let us remember that true consensus is born from genuine engagement, not manufactured unanimity. The courage to dissent, the willingness to question, and the strength to be authentically oneself are the antidotes to the consensus mirage. Only then can we break free from the illusion, reclaim our voice, and participate in a society where diversity of thought is not feared but celebrated. The emotional overload grid. Imagine a world where every second, a storm of information crashes into your mind like a relentless tidal wave. The notifications, the breaking headlines, the endless social feeds, flashing images, and urgent alerts, all arriving with a velocity so extreme that your rational mind, the gatekeeper that normally helps you process reality, begins to crumble. This is the emotional overload grid, a modern psychological crisis born from the saturation of volatile information and rapid emotional triggers flooding our consciousness. In this relentless flood, the mechanisms that help us filter, analyze, and respond calmly break down. The brain's logical filters, designed to help us make sense of a complex world, collapse under the sheer volume and intensity of data. Instead of thoughtful consideration, people experience a tidal surge of anxiety, confusion, and emotional fragmentation. Rationality becomes a distant island as emotional turbulence sweeps everything away, leaving individuals desperate to grasp at anything that feels like an anchor. Why does this happen? The answer lies in how our brains evolved versus the speed and scale of modern information delivery. For millennia, humans processed information in slow, meaningful chunks: face-to-face conversations, communal stories, and tangible experiences. Our emotional responses were calibrated to real-world threats and rewards, paced by natural rhythms. Today, however, information moves at lightning speed. A single tweet can trigger outrage, fear, or hope across millions within minutes. Viral videos flood screens with graphic or sensational content. The media cycles through crises with dizzying velocity. This overstimulation overwhelms the prefrontal cortex, the brain's seat of logic, leading to what we call emotional overload. The consequences of this overload are profound. When rational filters collapse, people no longer evaluate information with nuance or skepticism. Instead, they clutch tightly to whatever message offers immediate emotional relief or certainty. This often means embracing irrational beliefs, conspiracy theories, or extreme ideologies simply because they provide a sense of control or safety amidst chaos. The louder, more emotionally charged voices dominate the discourse, drowning out calm reason and critical thought. Consider the real-world example of public reactions during health crises or political upheavals. In moments of uncertainty, social media becomes a pressure cooker of anxiety. Misinformation spreads faster than verified facts because fear and hope both act as accelerants. Individuals paralyzed by anxiety may latch onto miracle cures, extremist solutions, or scapegoating narratives because these reduce complexity into simple, emotionally satisfying stories. The more intense the emotional bombardment, the more urgent the craving for relief, no matter how illogical the source. This phenomenon is not limited to fringe groups. Even well-meaning individuals can fall prey to emotional overload. The constant exposure to tragic news, economic uncertainty, and social polarization can exhaust mental resilience. This fatigue causes people to disengage or swing wildly between emotional extremes, from despair to denial, from panic to complacency. The cycle feeds itself as sensationalism in media seeks to capture attention, escalating emotional volatility and deepening overload. The emotional overload grid thus forms a dangerous feedback loop. Information arrives too fast and too emotionally charged for reason to keep pace. Anxiety spikes. People grasp at any message promising comfort or clarity, regardless of its truthfulness. This leads to greater division, misinformation, and social fragmentation. Rational dialogue becomes impossible as emotional noise drowns out facts, evidence, and empathy. Breaking free from this grid requires deliberate action and awareness. First, individuals must recognize the signs of emotional overload, feelings of constant anxiety, impulsive reactions, craving for certainty, and exhaustion from information saturation. Next, cultivating critical thinking and emotional regulation skills becomes essential. Practices such as mindful media consumption, deliberate pauses before reacting, and prioritizing credible sources can rebuild the brain's filtering capacity. On a societal level, platforms and media organizations must bear responsibility for how they design information flow. Algorithms that prioritize outrage and sensationalism exacerbate overload. Shifting towards promoting verified facts, slowing information velocity where possible, and encouraging balanced perspectives can reduce the emotional storm. Ultimately, the emotional overload grid is a symptom of a world transformed by hyperconnectivity and instant communication. It challenges the very foundations of how humans process reality, demanding new tools and practices to preserve sanity and rationality. Understanding this grid is the first step towards reclaiming calm in a turbulent informational sea. So the next time you feel your mind drowning in a sea of rapid, volatile information, remember, your brain's rational filters are under siege. Pause, breathe, seek clarity over certainty, and resist the lure of any message that promises instant relief at the cost of truth. The manufactured ritual trap. The manufactured ritual trap is a subtle yet deeply powerful mechanism by which authority captures the minds and hearts of people, transforming obedience into something resembling religious devotion. It's not just about rules or orders. It's about creating an entire sacred experience around power itself, a performance so carefully crafted and repeated that questioning it feels like sacrilege. At its core, this trap turns compliance into a ritual, a sacred dance where people don't just obey. They believe they must obey, not because of fear or logic, but because it feels holy, inevitable, and unchallengeable. Think about the ways power legitimizes itself through ceremonies and symbols, from ancient monarchs crowned with elaborate rites to modern political rallies filled with chants, flags, and uniform gestures. These are not accidental or trivial acts. They are designed with surgical precision to evoke awe, loyalty, and a sense of unity. When people participate in these rituals, their minds enter a state where critical thinking recedes and emotional bonds strengthen. They become part of something greater, something sacred. The repetition of slogans, the uniform gestures, the synchronized movements, these elements work like a hypnotic loop, programming the mind to associate obedience with reverence. For example, in many authoritarian regimes, daily or weekly mass gatherings serve as manufactured rituals where citizens chant slogans praising the leader, wave flags in unison, and perform synchronized salutes. This repetitive ritualistic behavior is far from harmless. It rewires psychological pathways, reinforcing the idea that the leader is not just a person with power, but a near-divine figure. In such a context, dissent is not only dangerous, It becomes unthinkable because it feels like blasphemy against something sacred. The manufactured ritual trap thus creates a social and psychological barrier to questioning authority. Beyond politics, this trap can be found in corporations, religious institutions, and even social movements, where repetitive mantras or slogans are employed to foster unquestioning loyalty. When you hear a catchy phrase repeated over and over in meetings or rallies, it's not just to boost morale, it's a deliberate attempt to embed that phrase deep into the collective subconscious. This ritualized repetition dulls skepticism and amplifies group identity, turning individuals into faithful adherents who defend the system instinctively. Even subtle cues like specific uniforms, badges, or rituals for entering or leaving spaces contribute to this effect. They build layers of symbolism that elevate the power structure to a sacred status. People begin to derive meaning and identity from their participation in these rituals, making the power structure inseparable from their sense of self. The trap lies in this blurring of boundaries. Once power becomes sacred, it transcends mere governance or influence and becomes a source of existential meaning, which no rational argument can easily dismantle. To understand the manufactured ritual trap deeply, we must examine its psychological underpinnings. Human brains are wired to seek patterns and ritual. Rituals reduce uncertainty and create predictability, which our minds crave. They also stimulate the release of neurochemicals like oxytocin and dopamine, which foster bonding and positive feelings. When a ritual is imposed by authority, these natural psychological rewards become hijacked to serve the interests of power. Over time, people not only obey, but actively defend the rituals themselves, feeling betrayal or guilt if they step out of line. A compelling example comes from history. Totalitarian states like Nazi Germany or North Korea used manufactured ritual traps extensively. Massive rallies with synchronized marches, fervent chants, and symbolic uniforms created a collective experience that transcended logic. People did not simply follow orders. They internalized the ideology as a sacred truth because the ritualized experience forged a deep emotional connection. This connection made it almost impossible to question the regime from within without risking alienation or psychological breakdown. But the trap is not limited to extremes. Even democratic societies are vulnerable. National holidays, flag salutes in schools, political party conventions, and media propaganda can all take on ritualistic qualities that subtly reinforce loyalty to the state or a party. These rituals are often so normalized that their power goes unnoticed. They quietly shape identities and beliefs over time, making people more likely to conform and less likely to critically evaluate the systems they support. The danger of the manufactured ritual trap is that it converts individuals into automatons of faith, even in secular contexts. It strips away the space for doubt and inquiry, replacing it with an instinctive need to participate and affirm. Once caught, breaking free requires immense courage because it feels like breaking a sacred bond, risking rejection, isolation, or even self-alienation. Understanding this trap offers a powerful tool for liberation. By recognizing the mechanics behind these rituals, the repetitive slogans, the symbolic acts, the manufactured sacredness, we reclaim our mental sovereignty. We can appreciate rituals that foster genuine connection without allowing them to become chains that enforce blind loyalty. Awareness enables us to ask, are we participating in these rituals out of genuine belief and critical choice, or because the system designed them to make us comply without question? In modern times, the manufactured ritual trap extends into social media and consumer culture. Think about how brands use repeated slogans, logos, and advertising rituals to create emotional bonds. Fans chant catchphrases and display symbols, turning consumption into a quasi-religious act. The same psychological mechanisms at work in political rituals fuel consumer loyalty, demonstrating how pervasive and adaptable this trap is. Ultimately, the manufactured ritual trap shows how power does not merely rule through force or coercion, but through the sanctification of itself. It creates a sacred theater where obedience is a ritual act of faith. This makes dismantling oppressive systems harder, because attacking the ritual is not just a political act. It feels like sacrilege. To resist, we must learn to see behind the performance, break the spell of repetition, and reclaim the freedom to question what feels too holy to question. The deeper truth is that rituals themselves are not evil. They are human tools for connection and meaning. The trap emerges when rituals are manufactured to serve power rather than the people. Recognizing the difference is essential for breaking free from this cycle and reclaiming authentic autonomy and critical thought in any society. Only by shining a relentless light on these manufactured ceremonies and slogans can we begin to unravel the layers of control wrapped in sacredness, freeing minds to think, feel, and act without the invisible chains of ritualized compliance. This is the manufactured ritual trap, a subtle prison cloaked in holiness where power masquerades as sacred and compliance becomes a devotional reflex, too holy to question, but impossible to ignore. The choice to awaken lies within each individual who dares to see beyond the ceremony and reclaim the right to question the unquestionable. The credibility fragment bomb. The world we live in is built on trust. We trust the facts presented to us, the experts who guide our understanding, and the narratives that shape our sense of reality. But what if that trust was deliberately shattered? What if the very foundations of credibility were fragmented, leaving us lost in a sea of doubt? This is the chilling phenomenon I call the credibility fragment bomb, a calculated, insidious tactic that dismantles our collective faith in truth by turning authoritative voices subtly against one another, so every claim becomes suspect. And while this chaos unfolds, the manipulators remain in the shadows, offering their own safe narrative, the only one left standing. At its core, the credibility fragment bomb is a strategic erosion of trust. Instead of openly attacking facts or experts, it quietly undermines them from within. Imagine multiple respected sources, each presenting conflicting information, but none outright disproving the others. The result? A fractured landscape where certainty evaporates. This fragmentation isn't accidental, it's engineered to create confusion and fatigue. When everything feels uncertain, the mind seeks refuge, often turning to the simplest, most comforting explanation, which is precisely what the manipulators want. To understand this deeply, consider the parallels with psychological warfare. In traditional conflict, sowing doubt among the enemy's ranks can be as powerful as any weapon. Similarly, in the battle for information, the credibility fragment bomb weaponizes doubt by making every trusted voice suspect. This fracture is not merely disagreement, it's a cascade of contradictions that leaves people paralyzed, unable to trust any source. Over time, this paralysis leads to resignation, an acceptance that truth is elusive, maybe even irrelevant. A striking example of this can be found in the realm of public health crises. During major pandemics, for instance, the public relies heavily on medical experts and authorities for guidance. But when these voices start presenting conflicting advice, sometimes due to evolving science, sometimes due to misinformation, the public's confidence crumbles. Early on, one expert might recommend mask wearing, while another questions its efficacy. One study suggests a treatment works, another warns against it. Instead of a unified front, we see splintered messages that sow doubt. The result? A population divided and skeptical, vulnerable to alternative narratives that promise clarity but often carry their own agenda. This tactic is devastatingly effective because it exploits a fundamental human cognitive bias, the need for certainty and coherence. When faced with contradictory claims, rather than holding all positions as equally valid, most people subconsciously seek a single coherent narrative. But when no consensus emerges, anxiety grows. The mind's natural defense is to retreat into simplistic beliefs, or echo chambers, where certainty is manufactured. Here lies the trap. Manipulators exploit this need by offering themselves as the sole credible source, the beacon in a fog of confusion they helped create. The fragmentation also thrives on the complexity of modern information ecosystems. Today's digital age floods us with an overwhelming amount of data from countless channels: news websites, social media, influencers, and government statements. This overabundance makes it easier than ever to selectively amplify conflicting voices, planting just enough dissent to fracture consensus without revealing who benefits from the chaos. Consider political discourse as another vivid battlefield for the credibility fragment bomb. In many countries, opposing parties or factions increasingly contradict each other on key facts, yet both maintain authoritative platforms. The media often highlights these conflicts without contextualizing their origins, leading citizens to distrust all sources equally. As trust in mainstream institutions fades, fringe voices claiming the real truth gain power. This cycle accelerates polarization and erodes social cohesion, making rational dialogue nearly impossible. What's crucial to understand is that the credibility fragment bomb doesn't rely on outright lies alone. It's far more nuanced. It uses half-truths, selective data, misleading framing, and strategic timing. Sometimes, it even leverages genuine mistakes or evolving knowledge as ammunition to deepen fractures. For example, if a credible expert admits uncertainty or revises previous statements based on new evidence, that very transparency can be weaponized by adversaries to brand them as unreliable. In this way, the very hallmarks of scientific rigor become perceived as weakness. This manipulation of credibility has profound psychological effects on individuals and societies. Prolonged exposure to fragmented truths leads to cynicism, apathy, and a dangerous disengagement from civic responsibilities. When nothing is trustworthy, people withdraw from public debate, become passive consumers of misinformation, or radicalize towards extremes that claim to restore certainty. The credibility fragment bomb thus doesn't just confuse facts, it destabilizes social fabric. One powerful historical example is the Cold War era's propaganda wars. Both superpowers intentionally disseminated contradictory messages to confuse not only the opposing population, but also their own citizens, fostering mistrust of official narratives. This fragmentation made it difficult for people to discern fact from fiction, creating a climate ripe for control through manufactured narratives. Today, the tools are more sophisticated, but the core strategy remains chillingly similar. To resist the credibility fragment bomb, we must cultivate media literacy and critical thinking at a societal scale. This means teaching individuals to recognize the tactics of fragmentation, to seek diverse but credible sources, and to value transparency and context over absolute certainty. It also means institutions must prioritize clear, consistent communication, admitting uncertainties without fueling distrust. But above all, it requires awareness that trust is fragile and must be actively maintained, not taken for granted. The credibility fragment bomb is a weapon of chaos wielded by those who understand that control comes not through overwhelming truth, but through the subtle destruction of trust itself. It's a slow, grinding process of erosion that leaves societies vulnerable to manipulation, division, and despair. But by exposing this tactic and understanding its mechanisms, we reclaim our power to demand clarity and coherence in an age of deliberate confusion. In a world fragmented by doubt, the greatest act of resistance is the courageous pursuit of truth, not as a fixed endpoint, but as a collective, evolving journey. This journey requires vigilance, empathy, and the rejection of false certainties offered by those who profit from our uncertainty. The credibility fragment bomb will continue to detonate around us, but we do not have to be its victims. This is the invisible war raging beneath headlines and hashtags, where reality itself is weaponized, and where our most precious resource, trust, becomes the battlefield. And the choice is ours, to succumb to the noise of fragmentation or to forge unity through shared commitment to truth. The Familiarity Reprogrammer. In every society, the boundaries between what is acceptable and what is monstrous are not fixed. They shift and bend over time, often without us noticing. This transformation happens not with loud, sudden shocks, but in subtle increments. This is the essence of the Familiarity Reprogrammer, the quiet, almost invisible process by which exposure to shocking or disturbing ideas in tiny doses reshapes our sense of normality, recalibrating our moral compass until policies and actions, once unthinkable, become ordinary, even invisible. The Familiarity Reprogrammer operates on a principle as simple as it is powerful. What is seen often becomes seen as safe. When we encounter an idea repeatedly, no matter how unsettling at first, our brains adapt. The initial shock dulls, the instinctive alarm fades, and gradually, acceptance grows. This is how monstrous policies, horrors wrapped in bureaucracy and euphemism, weave themselves into the fabric of daily life. They slip past our defenses not by overwhelming force, but by a relentless drip of normalized exposure. Consider historical examples that starkly illustrate this phenomenon. In the years leading up to some of history's darkest chapters, seemingly benign actions or statements, when repeated often enough, laid the groundwork for widespread acceptance of atrocities. In Nazi Germany, for instance, early propaganda and everyday language subtly dehumanized certain groups. Phrases once rare and shocking became commonplace in newspapers, speeches, and even casual conversation. Each microdose chipped away at empathy and outrage until policies of genocide were not only possible, but met with chilling acquiescence. The machinery of horror was lubricated by familiarity. In a more contemporary context, the slow normalization of invasive surveillance technologies offers a clear illustration of the familiarity reprogrammer at work. The idea that governments might track every move, record every conversation, or scan every face once inspired alarm and protest. But over years, through constant exposure to news reports, security rhetoric, and media narratives about safety, such surveillance became normalized. Many now accept it as a routine part of life, rarely questioning the cost to privacy or freedom. The monstrous idea of a panopticon society has been reprogrammed into familiarity. What makes the familiarity reprogrammer so insidious is its invisibility and its power to hijack the natural human tendency to seek comfort in routine. Our brains crave predictability. When a new idea or policy enters our lives gradually, we unconsciously rewire our expectations and emotional responses to it. This slow adaptation blindsides critical thinking and ethical resistance. We begin to live alongside policies that would have horrified us had they appeared all at once, never realizing that we've been conditioned to accept what should be rejected. This process is not limited to governments or large institutions. It permeates culture, media, and social interaction. The daily bombardment of divisive rhetoric, the relentless repetition of fear-inducing narratives, the casual tolerance of inequality, all these are forms of the familiarity reprogrammer operating in real time. For example, consider how casual language around discrimination or exclusion can shift public perception. What was once taboo or shameful can become a shrug-worthy norm when repeated endlessly in conversation and media. But why do we allow this to happen? Why doesn't the alarm bell keep ringing? The answer lies partly in cognitive fatigue and information overload. In a world flooded with constant stimuli and competing narratives, our minds prioritize efficiency over vigilance. The emotional filters that once registered moral violations become dulled by relentless exposure. Familiarity breeds not only contempt, but dangerous complacency. The familiarity reprogrammer also exploits our social nature. Humans are wired to conform, to align with perceived majority opinion and social norms. When repeated exposure convinces us that a policy or belief is widely accepted, dissent feels isolating and risky. This social pressure deepens the effect of the reprogramming, as individuals silence their doubts to fit in, reinforcing the new normal collectively. What can break this cycle? Awareness is the first and most crucial step. Recognizing that the slow drip of normalization is a weapon, an intentional or unintentional force that shapes our collective conscience, empowers us to resist. Historical vigilance teaches that moral clarity requires conscious effort, active questioning, and refusal to let repeated exposure dull our ethical senses. Education, media literacy, and critical thinking become vital tools to expose the familiarity reprogrammer's workings. We must challenge narratives that promote passive acceptance and cultivate spaces where alternative voices and critical perspectives are heard. The antidote to creeping normalization is disruption, interrupting patterns of repeated exposure with fresh, challenging viewpoints that force reconsideration. Moreover, personal reflection plays a role. We should ask ourselves, which ideas or policies have I come to accept that once felt unacceptable? How did that shift happen? Are there areas where my moral compass has been quietly recalibrated without my consent? Such questions cultivate a mindfulness that can counteract the reprogramming effect. In practical terms, movements that have successfully reversed harmful normalization relied on raising awareness through storytelling, exposing the gradual nature of acceptance, and rallying collective resistance before policies become entrenched. Civil rights movements, environmental activism, and anti-war campaigns all demonstrate the power of breaking the cycle of familiarity and reprogramming public consciousness toward justice and humanity. In conclusion, the familiarity reprogrammer is one of the most subtle and effective mechanisms by which power and control infiltrate societies. It thrives in the shadows of repetition, routine, and our natural desire for stability. To guard against it, we must remain vigilant, curious, and courageous, questioning not only what is presented to us, but how it is presented over time. Only by shining light on the slow transformation of shock into normalcy can we prevent monstrous policies from becoming everyday realities. Remember, change is possible, but only if we refuse to let familiarity blind us to injustice. Our ethical vigilance is the shield against the quiet, creeping tide of normalization that seeks to reshape our world, one microdose at a time. The Silence Punishment Protocol. Imagine a society where speaking the truth or questioning the official story doesn't lead to arguments, rebuttals, or open discussion, but instead to complete silence. Not the respectful silence of thoughtful consideration, but the chilling silence of deliberate invisibility. Your words, your concerns, your challenges are met with nothing but a void. No acknowledgement, no response, no debate, just a social blackout that erases your presence as if you never existed. This is the terrifying essence of what might be called the Silence Punishment Protocol. At first glance, ignoring someone who dares to dissent might seem harmless or even polite. But this calculated social tactic is a powerful form of punishment, designed not through physical violence or direct confrontation, but through the psychological weaponization of invisibility. When challengers to the dominant narrative find their voices unheard, their questions unanswered, and their very existence socially erased, a subtle yet devastating lesson is delivered. Speak truth, and you become invisible. This is not just a hypothetical idea. Across history and cultures, the power of silence has been used as a tool of control and conformity. In tribal societies, the ritual of shunning, the act of deliberately ignoring or excluding an individual, was a devastating punishment. The individual remained physically present but was socially dead. Their words held no weight, their presence no significance. The psychological toll was immense because humans are fundamentally social creatures who depend on acknowledgement and interaction for identity and meaning. In modern contexts, the Silence Punishment Protocol manifests in more insidious ways. When whistleblowers expose corruption or injustice, they are often not met with open debate, but with stonewalling and willful ignorance. Their reports might be dismissed quietly, their accusations never publicly addressed. This strategy trains observers, witnesses to these silences, to associate the pursuit of truth with social invisibility or marginalization. Over time, it creates an environment where raising uncomfortable questions becomes synonymous with social exile. Psychologically, this protocol exploits our deep-seated human need for recognition. Being heard and validated is foundational to our sense of self-worth. When that is stripped away, individuals often internalize their marginalization, doubting their own experiences or truths. Worse, onlookers witness this erasure and learn to avoid similar challenges, fearing the same social nullification. This creates a chilling effect far broader than the immediate victim. The Silence Punishment Protocol also undermines the very essence of dialogue and democracy. In any healthy society, truth is arrived at through contestation, debate, and the clash of ideas. When dissenting voices are silenced through invisibility rather than addressed, society becomes a one-dimensional echo chamber. The absence of engagement does not mean absence of truth. Often, it hides inconvenient realities that the powerful wish to bury. Consider the impact of this protocol in the digital age. Critics and whistleblowers find their content disappearing into the void, not deleted outright, but rendered socially irrelevant by lack of audience. This technological form of the Silence Punishment Protocol manipulates visibility and shapes public discourse by controlling what is seen or ignored. Even offline, in workplaces or social groups, this protocol plays out. A colleague who questions unethical practices might be met with cold shoulders, hushed conversations, and strategic exclusion from meetings or discussions. Their ideas and concerns vanish into the background noise. This silent rejection discourages others from speaking up, fostering compliance through the fear of social invisibility. The emotional and mental consequences of the Silence Punishment Protocol are profound. Being ignored is more painful than direct confrontation because it strips away our fundamental human need to be acknowledged and understood. It creates isolation and self-doubt, eroding confidence and silencing not just words, but entire identities. But the danger extends beyond individual victims. When entire communities learn that challenging official narratives leads to invisibility, skepticism, critical thinking, and activism wither. The social contract is broken, replaced by fear and apathy. Without open debate and visible dissent, societies stagnate, corruption flourishes unchecked, and injustice perpetuates in shadows. How do we resist such a protocol? Awareness is crucial. Recognizing when silence is being weaponized against truth-seeking allows us to see beyond the void and understand that silence is not consent. It is a tool of suppression. We must create and support spaces where voices, especially marginalized ones, are actively heard and engaged. We should question why some narratives are ignored and insist on accountability for erasures. Courage is essential. Speaking out despite invisibility requires resilience and a commitment to authenticity. Collective solidarity can transform individual silences into a chorus that breaks through enforced invisibility. When communities stand together, refusing to let voices be erased, the silence punishment protocol loses its power. In the end, the power of silence as punishment is rooted in the denial of human connection and recognition. It is a tactic that seeks to crush dissent, not through force, but through absence, an absence that speaks volumes. But silence can be broken, then truth can be amplified. The challenge lies in refusing to disappear into the void, in daring to speak even when unheard, and in building societies where no voice is ever rendered invisible. The controlled catastrophe cycle. Imagine a world where chaos is not accidental, but orchestrated with chilling precision. A world where disasters, natural, economic, or social, are not merely random calamities, but carefully timed events exploited to trap populations in an endless spiral of fear and helplessness. This is the controlled catastrophe cycle, a deliberate mechanism that sustains control by keeping minds trapped in dread, dependency, and confusion. At the heart of this cycle lies the strategic release of crises, each one engineered or magnified just enough to destabilize society without allowing it to recover fully before the next wave hits. This perpetual state of emergency erodes people's ability to think clearly, to trust their own judgment, and to act independently. Instead of empowerment, they are conditioned to cling desperately to authority figures or systems promising safety and order, even at the cost of freedom. Why would such a cycle be maintained? Power thrives in chaos when the masses are disoriented and dependent. When daily life feels precarious and uncertain, fear becomes the dominant emotional state. Anxiety clouds rational thought. Critical faculties dim. In this fog of persistent crisis, people crave stability, but only as it is defined and provided by those controlling the narrative and response. Take, for instance, the way economic downturns or manufactured financial shocks are timed alongside political unrest or natural disasters. Each catastrophe, presented as isolated and unavoidable, actually layers atop the previous one, never allowing the collective psyche to find firm footing. Governments may introduce sweeping emergency measures, justified by the ongoing crises, which gradually erode civil liberties and concentrate power. Populations caught in this relentless storm become habituated to surveillance, restrictions, and appeals to sacrifice personal freedoms for the greater good. This cycle operates through a blend of fear, misinformation, and tactical distraction. Media outlets often amplify anxieties by focusing on the most alarming aspects of events, emphasizing uncertainty and worst-case scenarios. Meanwhile, the public's attention is diverted from systemic problems or abuses of power, fixated instead on immediate threats. The narrative is controlled so tightly that dissent or alternative viewpoints are labeled as dangerous or irresponsible, deepening social polarization and mistrust. Real-world examples abound. Consider how certain regions have faced waves of crises, natural disasters, economic collapses, pandemics, or social upheavals that seem to follow an unending timeline. Each event resets the social clock, displacing focus from recovery to survival. The public grows fatigued, numb, and reliant on leaders who promise protection, but often leverage the crisis for political gain. This cycle also prevents true healing and progress. Without sufficient calm periods, societies cannot rebuild trust, restore institutions, or empower citizens to participate fully in democratic processes. Instead, they are stuck in a loop where fear justifies increased control, which then sets the stage for future catastrophes. It becomes a self-sustaining trap, a treadmill where movement feels constant, but direction is lost. To break free, awareness is crucial. Recognizing the pattern of controlled catastrophes helps individuals and communities resist manipulation. It requires questioning official narratives, demanding transparency, and fostering resilience, not through blind obedience, but through informed skepticism and collective action. Moreover, promoting media literacy and critical thinking becomes vital in discerning between genuine emergencies and manufactured crises. Societies must reclaim spaces for calm, dialogue, and healing, rejecting the notion that constant fear is normal or necessary. In the end, the controlled catastrophe cycle is a mechanism that exploits human vulnerability to chaos and uncertainty, weaponizing disaster to sustain power. Understanding its dynamics is the first step toward dismantling it, restoring agency, and building a future where crises do not define our existence, but are met with clarity, courage, and independence. Remember, true strength lies not in surrendering to perpetual fear, but in cultivating the resilience to face challenges with clear eyes and steady hearts. Only then can the cycle be broken and genuine freedom reclaimed. The selective empathy filter. Empathy, often hailed as humanity's greatest strength, can paradoxically become a tool of division and control when filtered selectively. The selective empathy filter is a subtle yet profoundly destructive phenomenon where compassion and emotional resonance are granted only to certain victims while the suffering of others is dismissed, minimized, or outright ignored. This creates a hierarchy of suffering, an emotional pecking order where some pain is seen as worthy of attention and aid, and other pain is deemed irrelevant, exaggerated, or even deserved. Such a filter warps our moral compass, making cruelty not only acceptable, but framed as necessary, just, and even virtuous. At the heart of this filter lies the human tendency to categorize, to group people into us and them, friend and foe, deserving and undeserving. This categorization shapes how empathy is distributed. When suffering occurs within the in-group, those we identify with by nationality, ethnicity, religion, worry, ideology, or even social class, our emotional brains activate with greater intensity. We feel the pain of our own as deeply personal, mobilizing feelings of solidarity, protection, and moral outrage. But when suffering touches an outgroup, people we see as rivals, enemies, or simply different, empathy wanes, often replaced by indifference, contempt, or justification for harsh treatment. This selective empathy is not an innocent oversight. It's often cultivated, weaponized by leaders, media, and social institutions to manipulate public opinion and legitimize acts of cruelty. By amplifying the suffering of favored victims and minimizing rival victims, narratives emerge that justify violence, oppression, and neglect as morally necessary. For example, in conflicts, each side highlights its own casualties as tragic and unjust, while portraying the enemy's suffering as exaggerated or deserved. This emotional framing supports ongoing cycles of retaliation and dehumanization, making reconciliation difficult and prolonging conflict. Historical and contemporary examples abound. During wars, propaganda often portrays one group's pain as pure victimhood, while denying or mocking the suffering of the opposing side. The Holocaust's memory has rightly been preserved with intense empathy for its victims, but other genocides or atrocities sometimes receive far less recognition or evoke weaker emotional responses, especially when the victims are from marginalized or unpopular groups. This disparity creates moral blind spots, where some atrocities are condemned fiercely, while others are ignored or relativized, not because of the scale or horror, but because of who the victims are. The media plays a critical role in reinforcing the selective empathy filter. News coverage tends to focus more on tragedies affecting populations culturally or politically aligned with the audience, while underreporting or trivializing distant or politically inconvenient suffering. This skewed empathy shapes public attitudes and foreign policy decisions, privileging aid, intervention, or outrage for some crises but not others. The filter shapes which stories move us to tears and which leave us unmoved, creating uneven global responses that perpetuate injustice. Psychologically, this filter emerges from cognitive biases like in-group favoritism and moral licensing. When we see ourselves as protectors of our victims, we feel justified in harsh actions toward them, convincing ourselves that cruelty is a regrettable but necessary step toward justice or security. This moral self-licensing dulls conscience and fuels cycles of violence, as empathy becomes a selective weapon rather than a universal guide. The consequences of selective empathy are devastating. It corrodes the foundation of universal human rights and undermines solidarity needed for peaceful coexistence. By allowing some suffering to be invisible or minimized, it enables abuses and injustices to continue unchecked. Worse, it poisons social cohesion, breeding resentment, hatred, and further conflict between groups. Breaking free from the selective empathy filter demands conscious effort and courageous self-reflection. It requires expanding the circle of empathy beyond familiar boundaries, recognizing the shared humanity in all suffering regardless of identity or allegiance. Education, diverse storytelling, and media accountability are essential tools to expose and challenge the narratives that fuel this filter. Individuals must resist the easy comfort of selective outrage and cultivate the uncomfortable habit of feeling empathy for all victims, even those labeled as rivals. In a world rife with division, the selective empathy filter acts as a psychological and social barricade, barricading compassion behind arbitrary walls. But empathy, when truly universal, becomes a revolutionary force that breaks down these walls and calls forth justice, not only for some, but for all. It invites us to confront our biases and see suffering not as a competition, but as a shared human experience that demands equal recognition and response. Understanding the selective empathy filter unveils the dark undercurrents beneath many conflicts and social injustices. It reveals how empathy can be manipulated to justify cruelty and how the moral hierarchy of suffering perpetuates cycles of violence. Only by consciously dismantling this filter can societies move toward genuine justice, healing, and peace. True empathy refuses to pick favorites. It recognizes every pain, every wound, every loss as deserving of our attention and care. In doing so, it dismantles the false moral hierarchies that make cruelty seem not only acceptable, but righteous. The path to a more compassionate and just world begins with breaking the selective empathy filter, one open heart at a time. The Identity Reinforcement Prism. The Identity Reinforcement Prism is one of the most subtle yet powerful forces shaping how societies fracture and how individuals lose their sense of self in modern times. Imagine a prism, a device that splits a single beam of light into many colors, except this prism doesn't reveal beauty. Instead, it fractures identity into rigid, superficial labels, slicing complex human beings into narrow, boxed-in tribes defined by race, politics, religion, nationality, or any other easily visible marker. Once viewed through this prism, people no longer see themselves as multifaceted individuals, but as members of fixed groups with prescribed beliefs, behaviors, and loyalties. This constant reinforcement of identity labels acts like a mental cage, shrinking perspectives and simplifying the rich complexity of human experience into tribal reflexes. Each group becomes an echo chamber, where repeated messages emphasize in-group purity and out-group threat. Over time, this conditioning hardens emotional responses, making people far easier to provoke, steer, and pacify. When you reduce a person's identity to a single prismatically colored facet, you remove their ability to think beyond group narratives, leaving them vulnerable to manipulation. Take social media as a perfect example. Algorithms are designed to amplify content that triggers emotional reactions, and tribal identity is the easiest trigger of all. A single post that praises your tribe or demonizes the other floods your feed repeatedly, reinforcing your tribal prism. This endless loop conditions reflexive responses, anger, fear, pride, that bypass critical thinking and push you deeper into your tribe. The more the prism sharpens, the less room there is for nuance, empathy, or genuine dialogue. Politicians and media figures have learned to weaponize the identity reinforcement prism expertly. By repeatedly framing issues through the lens of us versus them, they sharpen tribal lines, creating a polarized battlefield where compromise seems betrayal. Even complex policy debates are reduced to slogans that pit one group's survival against another's. This keeps populations divided, distracted, and easier to control because unified resistance is impossible when everyone is trapped in their own prism of identity. The psychological impact is profound. People begin to identify more with their tribe's narrative than with their own personal values or experiences. This leads to cognitive rigidity, rejecting ideas that don't fit the tribal story, and emotional volatility that can be easily triggered. In moments of crisis or uncertainty, tribal identity offers a false sense of security, a psychological anchor in a chaotic world. But that anchor is also a leash, tethering individuals to collective behaviors designed by external forces to maintain control. This prism distorts not only how we see ourselves, but also how we view others. When reduced to a label, entire groups become caricatures, stripped of individuality and humanity. This dehumanization makes it easier to justify hostility or indifference. Historical atrocities and modern conflicts alike have been fueled by the amplification of such simplistic identity divisions. The prism turns neighbors into enemies and fractures social trust at its core. Yet, this prism is not inevitable. Human identity is naturally fluid, layered, and dynamic. People belong simultaneously to many groups, families, professions, cultures, beliefs that intersect and overlap. The problem arises when a single label is magnified to eclipse the whole person, and that lens becomes the only way we relate to ourselves and others. Breaking free from the identity reinforcement prism requires conscious effort. It means cultivating awareness of how our perceptions are shaped by external forces seeking to divide. It means intentionally engaging with perspectives beyond our tribe, embracing complexity over simplification. It means reclaiming our individual narratives, values, and empathy as shields against tribal manipulation. In a world increasingly fractured by identity politics and tribalism, the identity reinforcement prism is a powerful tool of division and control. But by recognizing how it distorts perception and narrows our humanity, we take the first step toward healing the fractures it creates. Instead of being split and steered by superficial labels, we can choose to see ourselves and each other in full, complex light. Beyond prisms, beyond tribes, beyond manipulation. This journey back to wholeness is not easy. It challenges deeply ingrained reflexes and confronts the comforting illusions of belonging. Yet it is essential, because only by transcending the identity reinforcement prism can we restore genuine connection, nuanced understanding, and a collective resilience that no manipulation can shatter. The doubt saturation field, in an age where information flows faster than ever, a peculiar and dangerous phenomenon quietly reshapes how we think and act. This phenomenon is what I call the doubt saturation field, a relentless flood of contradictory claims and competing narratives that drown out certainty and exhaust the mind. When everything is questioned and nothing seems reliable, certainty itself becomes a joke, a relic of a simpler past. In this swirling chaos of doubt, many retreat, not toward truth, but into passivity, choosing silence and inaction over the shame of being proven wrong. Imagine turning on the news, opening social media, or joining a conversation, only to be bombarded instantly with conflicting versions of reality. One source claims a fact with conviction, another disproves it just as fiercely, and a third suggests the whole truth is unknowable. This constant clash breeds confusion so deep that the very idea of knowing anything for sure starts to feel impossible. The doubt saturation field doesn't just erode trust in a single idea, it dissolves trust in the whole concept of truth itself. Historically, this phenomenon isn't entirely new, but it has been turbocharged in recent decades by the explosion of digital platforms and the democratization of content creation. In earlier times, information passed through fewer filters: newspapers, official broadcasts, and trusted authorities. Today, billions of voices compete for attention, and with it, the monopoly on truth shatters. Every claim is challenged, every fact debated, and every expert questioned. While healthy skepticism is necessary, the doubt saturation field weaponizes skepticism to paralyze society. Consider how this saturation breeds a kind of intellectual exhaustion. The human brain has a finite capacity for processing uncertainty. When confronted with endless contradictions, cognitive overload sets in, and the natural response is to disengage. Rather than sifting through the noise to find clarity, many prefer to switch off, retreating into comfortable passivity. This is not apathy born of indifference. It is a protective mechanism against humiliation. Being wrong in public, especially repeatedly, carries social penalties and personal discomfort. The doubt saturation field exploits this vulnerability, making inaction the safer choice. One chilling example can be found in the realm of public health debates. When conflicting advice floods the media, one day a treatment is hailed as a miracle, the next it is condemned as dangerous. People lose faith in expert guidance altogether. Vaccine skepticism, for example, partly thrives because of this saturation. The conflicting claims don't just confuse, they generate distrust so profound that many retreat into echo chambers or disengage completely from critical health decisions. The stakes here are life and death. Yet, the doubt saturation field renders society incapable of collective action. Another domain ravaged by this phenomenon is politics. Contradictory claims, conspiracy theories, and selective fact presentation saturate political discourse to such a degree that citizens grow cynical and apathetic. They begin to believe that all sides are equally dishonest or corrupt, or worse, that truth is irrelevant. This breeds a vacuum where demagogues thrive, feeding off the distrust and passivity, reshaping societies around cynicism and disengagement. But the effects go deeper than mere confusion. The doubt saturation field weaponizes humiliation. In a world where knowledge is fragmented and contested, admitting ignorance or error becomes a social risk. People fear being publicly corrected or ridiculed for their beliefs. So instead of engaging in meaningful dialogue, they retreat into silence or tribalism, guarding their identity fiercely against the threat of contradiction. The very social fabric of trust and open exchange frays under this pressure. So, how do we resist the paralyzing grip of the doubt saturation field? The first step is acknowledging the problem, understanding that relentless doubt is not a path to enlightenment, but a trap designed to exhaust and disengage. We must reclaim the space for reasoned debate, where uncertainty is accepted, but does not become a weapon to undermine action. This means fostering environments where admitting ignorance or being wrong is seen as a step toward truth, not a mark of shame. Education plays a pivotal role here. Critical thinking must be taught not as cynicism, but as a tool for navigating complexity. Media literacy is vital to distinguish between well-founded claims and baseless contradiction. And perhaps most importantly, we need community and dialogue that prioritize empathy over victory. The doubt saturation field thrives on division and isolation. Breaking it requires connection and collective reasoning. In practical terms, this means demanding higher standards from information sources, supporting journalism that embraces nuance rather than sensationalism, and resisting the impulse to reduce every issue to binary opposition. It means recognizing that some truths are provisional but still actionable, and that waiting for absolute certainty in a complex world can be the enemy of progress. In conclusion, the doubt saturation field is one of the greatest hidden threats to modern society's ability to act, decide, and trust. It creates a world where certainty is ridiculed, truth is fragmented, and people hide in passivity out of fear of being wrong. But passivity is not safety. It is surrender. To overcome this, we must cultivate courage, the courage to face uncertainty, to admit mistakes, and to keep seeking clarity even when the flood of contradiction seems endless. Our minds and societies will only escape this saturation when we remember that doubt is a tool, not a trap, and that certainty is not the absence of question, but the commitment to truth despite it. Only then can we rebuild trust, restore collective will, and navigate the complex reality of our time with clarity and courage. The predictive programming blueprint. Imagine a world where the future is quietly scripted into the present, not through overt announcements or public debates, but hidden in plain sight, woven subtly into the fabric of popular culture. Movies, television shows, novels, and video games become the covert architects of tomorrow's realities, embedding visions of policies, technologies, or social changes long before they arrive in our lives. This is the essence of what is often called the predictive programming blueprint. At its core, predictive programming is a technique by which fictional scenarios are seeded into mass entertainment, years or even decades ahead of actual policy implementations or societal shifts. By familiarizing the public with these concepts in a fictionalized, dramatized form, the unimaginable is rendered inevitable, the shocking becomes normalized, and cultural resistance diminishes before the change ever takes place. The technique operates not through force, but through acclimatization, conditioning collective perception to accept as normal what was once unthinkable. This is not mere speculation or conspiracy fantasy. A closer look at history reveals striking correlations between popular media's depictions and real-world developments. Consider the portrayal of mass surveillance long before the age of ubiquitous digital tracking. Classic science fiction works envisioned omnipresent cameras, data mining governments, and personalized monitoring decades before these became integral parts of modern life. By the time such policies were rolled out, many people found themselves mentally prepared, their imaginations already acquainted with the concept through entertainment. The power of predictive programming lies in its subtlety. Unlike propaganda, which demands attention and persuasion, predictive programming works beneath the threshold of conscious awareness. It infiltrates dreams, fears, and fantasies through engaging storytelling, compelling characters, and immersive worlds. Audiences do not feel manipulated. Instead, they are entertained. Yet, beneath the surface, these narratives implant cognitive scripts, templates of what is plausible, acceptable, or even desirable in the future. Psychologically, this conditioning taps into a concept known as the mere exposure effect, where repeated exposure to an idea increases one's preference or acceptance of it, often without conscious realization. When dystopian governments, invasive technologies, or radical social changes become recurrent tropes in entertainment, the public becomes less resistant when such realities begin to emerge. What once sparked outrage or disbelief becomes met with resignation or even acceptance. Take, for example, the depiction of pandemics in film and television long before global outbreaks occurred. Storylines featuring viral contagions, quarantines, and emergency powers became a recurring theme, familiarizing audiences with scenarios that might otherwise cause panic. By presenting these crises as fictional narratives, the collective psyche gradually adapted, softening the shock of real-world occurrences. However, the predictive programming blueprint is not merely about preparing society, it can also serve more insidious agendas. By shaping expectations and framing potential futures, those in power can influence public opinion and limit the range of acceptable discourse. When the population is preconditioned to accept certain developments as inevitable, resistance movements struggle to gain traction. Dissent is muted because the narrative arc seems pre-written and immutable. This technique extends beyond government policies into technology adoption, social engineering, and economic shifts. Popular culture often previews advancements such as artificial intelligence integration, biometric identification, and digital currencies well before their mainstream introduction. By encountering these elements in fiction, people gradually lower their defenses, enabling smoother societal transitions when these technologies become real. Yet the line between benign foresight and manipulative conditioning can be blurry. Some creators genuinely explore possible futures out of curiosity or warning, while others might be complicit, willingly or unwittingly, participants in predictive programming efforts. The challenge for consumers is discerning entertainment from subtle indoctrination, imagination from engineered acceptance. How do we reclaim agency in a world shaped by predictive programming? Critical media literacy is paramount. By questioning the narratives we consume, analyzing underlying messages, and recognizing recurring themes, we can unmask the blueprint beneath the stories. Awareness disrupts the unconscious conditioning, empowering individuals to engage with ideas deliberately, rather than passively absorb them. Moreover, fostering diverse voices and alternative futures in media can counteract monolithic predictive narratives. When storytelling includes multiple perspectives and challenges dominant trajectories, it expands the collective imagination and preserves the possibility of different outcomes. This diversity of thought is a safeguard against deterministic acceptance of any single future. In a time when information flows ceaselessly and media saturation is complete, understanding the predictive programming blueprint is vital. It reminds us that culture is not merely a mirror reflecting society, but also a lens shaping it. The stories we tell today sculpt the realities we live tomorrow. Recognizing the power behind these narratives compels us to become active participants in shaping our future, rather than passive recipients of a scripted destiny. Only by shining light on this blueprint can we break free from invisible conditioning, reclaim our critical faculties, and ensure that the unthinkable remains open to choice, not just inevitability. The false equivalence, Ruse. In a world overwhelmed by information and competing narratives, there exists a subtle yet powerful tactic that quietly erodes our sense of justice and moral clarity. This is the false equivalence ruse, a manipulative framing device that distorts reality by equating wildly unequal actions, neutralizing outrage and confusion through a swamp of forced parity. At its core, the false equivalence ruse works by presenting two fundamentally different behaviors or events as if they were morally or practically the same. It draws a deceptive line of equivalence between a minor mistake and a profound corruption, a trivial error and systemic abuse, a momentary lapse and deliberate malevolence. This rhetorical sleight of hand doesn't just confuse facts, it weaponizes confusion, blurring the moral landscape so that outrage is muted and accountability dissipates. Why is this tactic so effective? Because it exploits our natural desire for fairness and balance. Humans are wired to seek symmetry and justice, to weigh sides equally before making judgments. The ruse hijacks this instinct, presenting an illusion of balance where none truly exists. By doing so, it creates a false narrative of mutual fault or equal blame, making it appear that everyone is equally culpable, and therefore, no one is fully responsible. Consider how political debates or media coverage often deploy this tactic. When one party commits a serious violation, whether corruption, deception, or abuse, the response is often met with a counterclaim that the opposing side has also erred, even if the scale and impact are dramatically different. This leads to headlines and conversations framed as "both sides do it" or "no one is innocent," effectively diluting the significance of genuine wrongdoing. This creates a dangerous paralysis in public discourse. Instead of recognizing and addressing the most severe problems, people are pulled into endless cycles of blame, where minor infractions and major crimes are lumped together as if they bear the same weight. Moral outrage is castrated, activism is discouraged, and real reform is stifled. The swamp of forced parity becomes a quagmire that traps society in indecision and cynicism. The consequences ripple far beyond politics. In social movements, corporate accountability, and even personal relationships, the false equivalence ruse can derail efforts toward justice and truth. It allows perpetrators to evade scrutiny by pointing to minor flaws in their accusers. It invites onlookers to dismiss serious claims as just part of the same problem, fostering a climate of apathy and distrust. Real-world examples abound, from media coverage that equates isolated mistakes with systemic oppression to public debates that reduce complex issues into simplistic he said, she said disputes, obscuring deeper truths. This tactic feeds a culture of relativism, where the difference between right and wrong becomes blurred, and moral clarity becomes a casualty. Breaking free from this ruse demands vigilance and critical thinking. It requires refusing to accept superficial comparisons and demanding that actions be judged on their own merit and context. Recognizing the scale, intent, and consequences behind behaviors is essential to dismantle the illusion of false equivalence. It also calls for media literacy, understanding when framing is manipulative, and learning to seek nuanced, fact-based analysis instead of soundbite symmetry. Only by piercing through the fog of false parity can society restore accountability, foster genuine outrage where it is deserved, and support meaningful change. In the end, the false equivalence ruse is more than just a debate tactic. It is a weaponized distortion that corrodes justice and quiets conscience. It traps us in a moral swamp where all actions seem equally flawed and all responsibility becomes diffuse. But awareness is the antidote. By sharpening our discernment and refusing to fall into the trap of forced parity, we reclaim clarity, confront real wrongdoing, and rebuild the foundations of trust and fairness. Remember, true justice does not come from equating all faults, but from seeing and responding to the true scale of harm. Only then can outrage be righteous and change be real. The symbol hijack doctrine. Ancient symbols carry power far beyond their surface shapes. They are vessels of deep primal emotions encoded by generations, carrying meaning that transcends words and logic. The symbol hijack doctrine is the deliberate repurposing of these ancient signs, not to honor their original meaning, but to exploit their emotional charge. This doctrine weaponizes symbolism as a tool of control, embedding commands and loyalty into the subconscious mind through imagery that bypasses conscious resistance entirely. Humans have evolved to respond instinctively to symbols. From the protective triangle to the life-affirming spiral, symbols act as shortcuts in the brain, triggering feelings rooted in survival, belonging, or awe. These responses are not intellectual, but visceral, hardwired into our emotional circuitry. When symbols are hijacked, twisted, or reassigned by those in power, they become covert channels for influence, manipulating feelings before reason even has a chance to engage. Consider how political movements, corporations, or cults adopt ancient symbols, reshaping them into logos or emblems. The swastika, for example, was an ancient symbol of good fortune and spirituality in many cultures. But when appropriated by the Nazis, it became a tool to evoke intense tribal loyalty and fear, embedding obedience and hatred into the psyche of millions. This repurposing transformed a once benign or sacred symbol into a potent emblem of terror and control, demonstrating the profound impact of symbolic hijacking. The symbol hijack doctrine operates by encoding control into imagery that slides beneath awareness. People don't consciously debate or reject a symbol's meaning because their response is immediate and emotional. This bypass of rational filters makes symbols ideal tools for installing loyalty, shaping group identity, and reinforcing authority. The repeated exposure to hijacked symbols during rallies, media, merchandise, and digital spaces conditions subconscious acceptance, making resistance feel unnatural or impossible. This method is subtle yet omnipresent. Corporate brands employ symbols designed to evoke trust, power, or warmth by tapping into ancient symbolic languages. Religious institutions use sacred geometry and iconography that stir feelings of reverence and submission. Governments display flags and seals layered with historical and mythic symbolism to inspire patriotism and obedience. Each is an example of the symbol hijack doctrine at work, encoding messages that stick in the subconscious, forging emotional bonds that defy simple logic. Psychologically, this hijacking exploits the brain's pattern recognition and emotional processing centers. The amygdala reacts instantly to symbolic cues, triggering feelings before the prefrontal cortex, the seat of conscious thought, can analyze meaning. This means symbols can create loyalty or fear reflexively, making them powerful levers of social control. When people carry or display a hijacked symbol, they participate in a ritual of allegiance, reaffirming the encoded control within their own subconscious. Resistance to the symbol hijack doctrine requires conscious awareness and critical deconstruction of symbolic language. Learning the origins, histories, and multiple meanings of symbols breaks the hypnotic grip of hijacked imagery. Education and media literacy empower individuals to recognize when symbols are being manipulated to serve agendas rather than authentic cultural or spiritual meanings. This awareness reactivates the conscious mind's veto power over subconscious programming. The data flood suppression. The data flood suppression is a modern-day tactic so pervasive and overwhelming that it quietly dismantles our ability to understand reality. Picture an avalanche, an unstoppable, crushing wave, not of snow, but of information. This avalanche doesn't deliver knowledge. Instead, it buries the crucial facts beneath mountains of irrelevant data, noise, and distraction. The result is exhaustion, a mental fatigue so profound that by the time any real clarity tries to break through, most people have already given up, abandoning curiosity and critical thought in sheer overwhelm. In today's digital era, the volume of information is unprecedented. Every second, thousands of articles, videos, social media posts, notifications, and messages flood our devices. While some of this data is valuable, the vast majority is filler, sensationalism, or outright noise. This relentless bombardment forces the human brain into constant triage mode, frantically scanning, filtering, and discarding information just to keep up. Our attention, a finite resource, becomes depleted under this assault. This phenomenon is not accidental. It is a calculated strategy used by those who wish to suppress inconvenient truths or manipulate public opinion. By flooding the environment with an unending stream of distractions and trivialities, they ensure that important facts become like needles lost in a haystack, or worse, never surface at all. When clarity does emerge, it arrives too late to reclaim lost attention or influence decisions effectively. Take, for example, major political scandals or public health warnings. Instead of dominating public discourse, these critical stories are quickly drowned out by a tidal wave of celebrity gossip, viral memes, conflicting narratives, and sensational clickbait, People's news feeds become chaotic battlegrounds where signal and noise merge indistinguishably. As a result, vital information is no longer a beacon, but a whisper in a storm, heard only by the most persistent or those specially trained to sift through the chaos. The psychological toll is immense. The constant flood induces what can be called information fatigue, where the brain's natural curiosity and drive to understand are replaced by apathy and disengagement. This mental shutdown is a defense mechanism, a way to protect oneself from overload, but it also plays perfectly into the hands of manipulators who count on collective exhaustion to maintain control. Moreover, this flood doesn't merely tire individuals, it fractures collective understanding. When different groups receive and prioritize different fragments of information, often filtered by algorithms tuned to reinforce existing biases, shared reality erodes. The avalanche of data not only buries facts, but also splinters the public into isolated islands of partial truths, each overwhelmed in their own ways, unable to connect or engage in meaningful dialogue. This tactic also exploits how modern attention works: fast, shallow, and fragmented. Most people skim headlines or short snippets rather than engaging deeply. When every moment is a race to consume the latest tidbit, there is no time or energy left for reflection, cross-checking, or in-depth analysis. The data flood suppression ensures that the intellectual groundwork necessary for informed decisions and societal progress is never laid. History shows us how controlling the flow of information can shape societies, but today's flood is uniquely insidious because it overwhelms rather than censors. Traditional censorship blocks or removes information outright, which can provoke backlash or curiosity. In contrast, drowning information in noise is subtle, harder to detect, easier to deny, and more psychologically draining. It is a form of control through exhaustion, a silent suffocation of awareness. Combating the data flood. Suppression requires deliberate strategies. Individuals must cultivate information hygiene, curating trusted sources, setting boundaries on consumption, and engaging in focused, deep learning rather than passive scrolling. Institutions and platforms have a responsibility to design systems that prioritize quality over quantity to resist the temptation of endless content churn. Education must emphasize critical thinking and digital literacy so that people can recognize when they are drowning rather than swimming in information. Ultimately, the data flood suppression is a battle over our collective attention and understanding. It weaponizes abundance to create scarcity, not of information, but of meaning. In this flood, truth is not destroyed, but buried, waiting for those willing to dive deep, sift carefully, and resist the exhaustion that the avalanche intends to impose. The challenge is immense, but so is the reward. By reclaiming our attention and cultivating sustained curiosity, we break free from the suppression and reclaim clarity. We turn the avalanche back into a stream, the oscillating enemy effect. In the shadowy realm of psychological warfare and social control, there exists a subtle yet devastating phenomenon known as the oscillating enemy effect. This strategy thrives on emotional whiplash, where the perceived enemy is not painted with a single clear brush, but is alternately demonized and pitied in rapid succession. The effect is a deliberate manipulation of perception and emotion, designed to keep the collective psyche off balance, confused, and ultimately weakened. So much so that the will to resist fades, and even the ability to clearly define the threat itself dissolves into uncertainty. To understand the power of the oscillating enemy effect, imagine a target population subjected to waves of conflicting narratives about a supposed adversary. One moment, the enemy is cast as a monstrous villain, ruthless, cruel, and inhuman. The media, leaders, and influencers amplify this image relentlessly, stirring fear, hatred, and a rallying cry for resistance. Yet, before those emotions can fully settle, the narrative pivots. The same enemy is suddenly portrayed as pitiable, desperate, or even relatable, victims of circumstance or propaganda themselves. Sympathy and doubt creep in, softening the hardened resolve built moments before. This rapid switching between extremes destabilizes emotional responses. Instead of rallying the population behind a clear, actionable understanding of who and what the enemy is, the oscillating enemy effect induces cognitive dissonance. The emotional energy required to hate and fight shifts abruptly into confusion and compassion, then back again. This roller coaster exhausts psychological resources, leaving people unsure where they stand, and less likely to unite or mobilize. Historically, this tactic has been employed in various conflicts and political struggles, often under the guise of information strategy. During wartime propaganda campaigns, for example, governments might vilify opposing forces as brutal aggressors while simultaneously releasing stories of enemy soldiers as misguided victims of their own leaders. This duality muddles public opinion and complicates the moral clarity needed for sustained opposition. In modern media ecosystems, the oscillating enemy effect operates with even greater potency. News cycles, social media platforms, and rapid-fire headlines churn out conflicting portrayals of adversaries so quickly that audiences rarely have the time or space to process and resolve their feelings. An opposing group may be labeled as terrorists or criminals one day, only to be depicted as oppressed minorities or sympathetic underdogs the next. This deliberate inconsistency generates an emotional exhaustion that fractures public consensus. This effect is not accidental. It is a deliberate tool wielded by those who understand that the greatest threat to control is a unified, resolute opposition. When people are confused about who the enemy really is, their capacity to resist is undermined. Instead of focusing anger or energy on a clear adversary, they become trapped in cycles of uncertainty and debate, fracturing collective will. Moreover, the oscillating enemy effect amplifies polarization and tribalism. As emotions swing wildly, factions form around competing interpretations of the enemy, some doubling down on hatred, others advocating empathy, and many retreating into skepticism or apathy. This splintering further dilutes resistance, as energies are consumed by internal conflicts rather than outward action. One vivid example is the media's treatment of complex international conflicts. Consider how a rebel group in a war zone might be alternately branded as terrorists and freedom fighters, depending on shifting political alliances and media narratives. Citizens far removed from the conflict struggle to discern truth amid these oscillations, leading to disengagement or fragmented opinions that weaken advocacy or intervention. On a personal level, this effect also affects how individuals perceive threats in their own lives. When a person or group oscillates between enemy and victim status, it becomes harder to set boundaries, maintain clarity, or respond decisively. The mind's natural drive to categorize and simplify is overwhelmed by contradictory signals, leaving the will to act suspended in limbo. So, how do we break free from the oscillating enemy effect? Awareness is crucial. Recognizing the pattern of emotional manipulation and its purpose empowers us to seek stability amid chaos. We must strive for nuanced understanding, acknowledging complexity without succumbing to confusion. Emotional intelligence plays a vital role here, developing the ability to hold empathy and critical distance simultaneously, without allowing rapid narrative shifts to hijack our response. Media literacy is equally essential. By critically evaluating sources, questioning motives behind sudden narrative swings, and demanding consistent evidence, we can inoculate ourselves against manipulation. Community dialogue that encourages honest, multifaceted discussion without descending into binary thinking helps build resilience to the oscillations. Ultimately, resisting the oscillating enemy effect means reclaiming the power to define our threats on our own terms, grounded in clarity rather than chaos. It requires patience, reflection, and courage to sit with discomfort and uncertainty without surrendering to manipulation. In a world awash with contradictory information and emotional tug-of-wars, the oscillating enemy effect is a reminder that our greatest weapon is our ability to remain centered, to see beyond the swings, hold steady, and preserve the will to resist, even when the lines between friend and foe blur. Only by mastering this balance can we hope to confront real threats with clear eyes and unwavering resolve, refusing to be drained by the exhausting dance of demonization and pity. The controlled opposition. Theater. Imagine a world where rebellion itself is a stage, an elaborate theater designed not to overthrow power, but to sustain it, where the very forces that appear to challenge the status quo are not genuine insurgents, but carefully crafted actors, playing roles assigned by those in control. This is the unsettling reality of what we might call the controlled opposition theater. At its essence, this phenomenon involves the creation of a designated faction that seems to oppose prevailing authority or dominant narratives. Yet, behind the curtain, it is tightly controlled and managed by the same power it pretends to resist. Its purpose is not to disrupt or dismantle, but to absorb dissent and channel it into safe, pre-approved avenues. By doing so, the controlled opposition theater neutralizes genuine challenges before they can gain momentum, ensuring no real alternatives arise outside of sanctioned boundaries. History offers chilling examples of this dynamic. Totalitarian regimes often stage sham opposition parties or dissenting voices that appear to offer choice and debate, but in reality serve as instruments of control. By giving the illusion of contestation, they disarm citizens' impulses to seek authentic change. In some cases, these opposition groups actively collaborate with authorities, undermining grassroots movements and misdirecting public frustration. Psychologically, the controlled opposition theater exploits the human desire for representation and agency. When people see their grievances reflected, even superficially, they feel heard, reducing urgency for deeper rebellion. It creates a mirage of empowerment, where participation in the theater replaces genuine activism. This dynamic is compounded by media amplification that elevates controlled dissenters as credible alternatives, shaping public perception to believe change is underway, even as the system remains intact. In modern democratic contexts, the theater is more subtle, yet no less pervasive. Political parties, activists, or commentators may be co-opted or infiltrated, their messages diluted or redirected to maintain the existing power structure. This controlled opposition saps energy from independent movements, fracturing coalitions, and fostering cynicism among the populace. When every perceived rebel is tainted by association, true insurgency struggles to emerge. Moreover, the theater plays on the public's skepticism and fatigue. In a landscape where every opposition seems compromised, many resign to apathy, believing authentic change is impossible. The controlled opposition. Theater thrives on this exhaustion, maintaining control through manufactured hopelessness. The cycle perpetuates itself. Dissent is presented, absorbed, neutralized, and the illusion of freedom preserved. Consider how this tactic affects the social and political imagination. It narrows the scope of what is deemed possible or acceptable. By limiting alternatives to those within the theater, radical or transformative ideas are marginalized or dismissed as fringe. This confinement shapes discourse, policy, and culture, reinforcing the dominance of entrenched interests. Resistance to the controlled opposition theater demands acute awareness and critical inquiry. It requires discerning genuine movements from managed ones and questioning the origins, funding, and affiliations of opposition groups. Transparency and accountability become essential tools for unraveling the theater's scripts. Collective action beyond the theater's stage involves cultivating independent spaces, amplifying authentic voices, and fostering solidarity across diverse movements. It means refusing to settle for the mirage of change offered by controlled dissent and insisting on systemic transformation that transcends sanctioned opposition. In an era marked by information warfare, social manipulation, and political theater, the controlled opposition theater is a sophisticated tool of power preservation. It masquerades as resistance, but serves as the ultimate co-optation, turning rebellion into spectacle and activism into performance. Understanding this theater compels us to look beyond appearances, to question who writes the scripts, who casts the players, and who benefits from the show's continuation. It challenges us to reclaim rebellion from the stage and reimagine resistance as a force unbound by control or pretense. Only then can authentic alternatives emerge, born not of manipulation or design, but of genuine collective will, creativity, and courage. The theater can be dismantled, but only if we refuse to be mere spectators and become active architects of real change. The heritage weaponization scheme. History is more than just stories of the past. It is the foundation of identity, belonging, and meaning. Yet, what if this foundation could be twisted, fractured, and wielded as a weapon? This is the heritage weaponization scheme, a calculated manipulation where shared history is selectively edited, reshaped, and weaponized so that collective memory becomes a tool of guilt or pride, pressuring individuals to act not as free agents, but as avatars carrying the weight of ancestral narratives. At the heart of this scheme lies control through identity. By controlling how history is remembered and interpreted, those in power can influence entire populations to internalize prescribed roles, either as victims burdened with inherited guilt or as inheritors of unassailable pride. In both cases, the individual's autonomy is overshadowed by the collective's scripted legacy. The past becomes a chain that binds the present, compelling behavior that aligns with a constructed narrative rather than personal truth. This weaponization is neither accidental nor benign. It is a strategic act that leverages the deep human need for belonging and meaning. People naturally seek connection to their roots. The stories of ancestors give context to who they are and where they come from. But when these stories are curated to emphasize selective triumphs or traumas, they become tools of social and political pressure. The collective memory transforms into a moral mandate, demanding conformity to ideals rooted not in the present reality, but in a crafted historical narrative. For example, groups or nations may emphasize historic victimhood, highlighting centuries of oppression to foster solidarity and vigilance. While acknowledging past suffering is important, weaponized history turns remembrance into perpetual guilt, an inherited burden that demands constant reparation or defense. Individuals are reminded again and again of ancestral wounds, expected to act as living embodiments of this pain, shaping their choices and loyalties according to a prescribed role in the ongoing narrative of grievance. Conversely, the scheme can invoke pride by glorifying selective victories, cultural superiority, or ancestral greatness. This selective pride builds identity around an idealized past, demanding that individuals uphold a legacy of dominance or exceptionalism. In this way, pride becomes a sword used to silence dissent or to justify exclusion, making anyone who challenges the narrative an enemy of the shared heritage. Both extremes weaponize history to limit personal freedom. The pressure to act as an avatar of ancestral narratives suppresses complexity, diversity, and the natural evolution of culture and identity. It traps people in cycles of inherited emotion and expectation, reducing individuals to mere vessels of collective memory rather than autonomous beings capable of shaping their own futures. The consequences ripple deeply across societies. Education, public discourse, and cultural expression become battlegrounds where competing versions of history are wielded like weapons. Truth is often sacrificed to ideology. Dialogue is replaced by dogma. The past becomes less about understanding and more about control, as groups vie to define history in ways that reinforce their current power and suppress others. This weaponization also fractures societies internally, creating divisions rooted in competing histories of guilt and pride. It fosters an us versus them mentality, where reconciliation becomes difficult because the narratives themselves are zero-sum. Those who do not embrace the sanctioned collective memory risk ostracism, accusation of betrayal, or erasure from the shared identity. To resist the heritage weaponization scheme requires courage and critical awareness. It means questioning inherited narratives, seeking multiple perspectives, and recognizing the difference between honoring history and being enslaved by it. It means reclaiming history as a source of learning and growth, rather than a tool of manipulation. Individuals and societies must cultivate the ability to hold complex truths, acknowledging both the darkness and the light of their past, without being trapped in cycles of guilt or pride. This balanced remembrance empowers autonomy, allowing people to define their identities beyond ancestral shadows, and to participate in shaping a future not dictated by the chains of selective memory. In a world where history can be weaponized, the greatest act of freedom is to remember honestly, to honor complexity, and to choose identity consciously rather than inherit it unconsciously. Only by breaking free from the weight of manipulated heritage can individuals and societies heal, evolve, and create authentic legacies of their own making. Remember, history is a story to guide, not a shackle to bind. When we reclaim it from weaponization, we reclaim our power to live with truth, choice, and integrity. The amplified outrage mechanism. The amplified outrage mechanism is a powerful and insidious psychological and social phenomenon where relatively minor offenses or slights are blown out of proportion, transformed into crises that feel existential and urgent. This amplification serves to mobilize large groups of people into highly emotional, often reactive mobs, while paradoxically downplaying or minimizing truly grave abuses and systemic injustices. The result is a society trained to erupt with volcanic fury over trivial provocations, yet remain numb or indifferent to the real lasting harm happening beneath the surface. At its core, this mechanism manipulates attention and emotion by skewing the scale of outrage. Minor incidents, an offhand comment, a misunderstood gesture, or a symbolic slight, are inflated through social media echo chambers, sensationalist news cycles, and partisan rhetoric into events of monumental moral significance. This creates an emotional feedback loop where outrage is rewarded and intensified, encouraging people to respond instinctively and fiercely to small triggers. Meanwhile, genuine abuses, those involving real harm, injustice, or suffering, are often overshadowed or dismissed as less urgent. This occurs because the constant bombardment of amplified outrage over minor issues floods public consciousness, overwhelming the capacity for sustained attention or nuanced understanding. Over time, this trains individuals and communities to react reflexively to superficial provocations while becoming desensitized or cynical about serious problems that require deeper engagement and long-term action. A vivid example can be found in the dynamics of social media platforms, where algorithms prioritize content that generates strong emotional reactions. A minor faux pas or ambiguous statement can quickly spiral into viral outrage, fueling online mobs demanding punishment, boycotts, or cancellation. The speed and scale of this outrage often leave little room for context, dialogue, or mercy. Yet, systemic issues like institutional racism, economic inequality, or government corruption may receive comparatively less passionate or consistent response, as they lack the immediacy or simplicity that triggers the amplified outrage cycle. Psychologically, the mechanism exploits humans' evolved sensitivity to social threats and status signals. Our brains are wired to detect slights that could endanger group cohesion or personal standing, triggering strong emotional responses to protect ourselves socially. When minor offenses are artificially magnified, this survival instinct becomes hijacked, causing disproportionate emotional reactions. The mechanism rewards such responses socially and digitally, reinforcing a cycle where people increasingly expect and seek out outrage as a form of identity and belonging. The consequences of the amplified outrage mechanism are profound and troubling. It fragments societies into polarized factions, each mobilized by their own manufactured crises. It undermines reasoned discourse by privileging emotional intensity over facts or context. It exhausts the collective emotional reservoir, leaving communities vulnerable to apathy when real crises emerge. Perhaps most dangerously, it shifts focus away from structural change toward performative displays of anger that may feel satisfying but accomplish little. Breaking free from this mechanism requires cultivating emotional discernment and critical thinking. Recognizing the difference between a legitimate crisis demanding action and a manufactured outrage designed to provoke reaction is essential. Media literacy and mindfulness can help individuals pause before responding, seeking context and evidence rather than succumbing to the immediate emotional surge. Societies benefit when channels of communication prioritize sustained engagement with real issues over viral spectacles of indignation. The amplified outrage mechanism is not an inevitable fate, but a learned pattern that can be unlearned. By fostering spaces for genuine dialogue, encouraging empathy even in disagreement, and valuing nuanced understanding over simplistic moral panic, communities can reclaim their emotional balance. This paves the way for outrage that is proportionate, purposeful, and directed toward meaningful change rather than fleeting spectacle. In essence, this mechanism reveals how the weaponization of emotion can distort social priorities, training people to erupt with volcanic fury at trivial cues while allowing genuine abuses to fester unnoticed. Awareness of this pattern empowers individuals and societies to resist manipulation, channeling outrage into constructive action grounded in truth and justice. Only by discerning the manufactured from the meaningful can we harness outrage as a force for good, transforming it from a tool of division and distraction into a catalyst for genuine progress and healing. The reflection replacement trick. The reflection replacement trick is a masterful psychological sleight of hand that transforms public figures from concrete individuals into mere mirrors reflecting the desires, fears, and hopes of their followers. Instead of being seen as real, complex people with flaws and contradictions, these leaders become blank canvases, empty screens onto which supporters project their own ideals, biases, and fantasies. This creates a powerful illusion, a leader who appears universally trustworthy and infallible, simply because they are not truly known at all. At its heart, this trick exploits a basic human tendency, the need to see ourselves in those we follow or admire. When a public figure speaks, many listeners hear not just words, but echoes of their own inner desires. This projection is amplified by controlled messaging, charisma, and media framing that intentionally keeps the leader's true nature obscured. The leader's identity becomes a reflection, constantly shaped and reshaped by the collective yearnings of the audience. This phenomenon is not new, but it has intensified in the digital age. Social media platforms, 24-hour news cycles, and highly curated public images create a perfect environment for the reflection replacement trick. Leaders rarely reveal their full selves. Instead, they present carefully constructed personas that invite projection. Followers fill the gaps with their own hopes, be it for strength, wisdom, justice, or change, turning the leader into a living illusion more than a person. One vivid example is the cult of personality around charismatic politicians or celebrities. They become symbols rather than people, embodying ideals that unite diverse groups. Criticism or contradictory facts about them are often dismissed or ignored because they threaten the carefully maintained illusion. Instead of reevaluating the leader, followers double down on their projections, reinforcing the blank screen and deepening the bond. This dynamic has profound consequences for both leaders and followers. Leaders become less accountable because their true selves remain hidden behind the projections. They may begin to perform the role expected rather than act authentically. Followers lose touch with reality, mistaking the reflection for truth. This disconnection can lead to disillusionment or even fanaticism when the illusion inevitably falters. The reflection replacement trick also complicates public discourse. When leaders are seen not as individuals, but as universal mirrors, dialogue becomes polarized. Supporters defend the illusion fiercely, while opponents attack an image that may never have existed. The space for nuanced understanding shrinks, replaced by mythic battles over symbolic figures. Breaking free from this trick requires conscious awareness. It means recognizing the difference between the person and the projections cast upon them. It demands critical engagement with leaders, seeking transparency and authenticity rather than idealized images. For followers, it is a call to reclaim their own agency, understanding that projecting desires onto others is a reflection of internal needs, not external realities. In an era where image often outweighs substance, the reflection replacement trick is a potent form of manipulation. It turns leaders into living illusions and followers into co-creators of a shared fantasy. But illusions, no matter how convincing, cannot substitute for truth. By seeing beyond the mirror, we regain the ability to hold leaders accountable, engage honestly, and build trust grounded in reality rather than projection. This is the subtle dance of identity and perception, where power thrives in the space between what is and what is imagined. The reflection replacement trick reveals how easily reality can be replaced by reflection, and challenges us to look deeper, to see the person behind the image, the truth behind the illusion, and the freedom beyond the projection. The eternal emergency state. In the corridors of power and the theaters of governance, a new normal has quietly taken root, a state of perpetual crisis known as the eternal emergency state. This is a phenomenon where official proclamations declare a crisis without end, transforming what might have been a temporary response into an unending justification for extraordinary control. The original threat fades, sometimes into memory or myth, yet the emergency measures remain, expanded, entrenched, and normalized. The eternal emergency state is not merely about crisis management. It is about crisis as a governing tool. Governments, institutions, and authorities invoke emergencies repeatedly or indefinitely, creating a framework in which normal rules are suspended and exceptional powers become the standard operating procedure. Laws are bent or rewritten, civil liberties curtailed, surveillance escalated, and dissent muted, all under the banner of urgency and necessity. Historically, states of emergency were designed for short-term use, a response to war, natural disaster, or genuine public peril. But the eternal emergency state weaponizes the concept, extending the emergency beyond its expiration date. This extension is rarely acknowledged openly. Instead, it is masked behind shifting narratives, new threats, or vague warnings of future dangers. The crisis becomes a perpetual state of exception, where normal democratic processes and accountability dissolve into an ongoing suspension of rights. Consider examples from the modern world that illustrate this troubling trend. Following major terror attacks, many countries enacted sweeping security laws meant to be temporary. Yet years later, many of these laws remain in force, justified by an ever-present threat of terror. Similarly, health crises have been used to introduce extraordinary powers that linger well beyond the immediate danger. In some cases, the emergency justifies unprecedented surveillance infrastructure and social restrictions that reshape societies fundamentally. What makes the eternal emergency state so insidious is its ability to condition populations into accepting an ongoing loss of freedoms as a necessary sacrifice. The language of emergency appeals to primal fears, fear of chaos, violence, or disease, compelling people to relinquish rights in exchange for a promise of safety. Over time, this trade-off hardens into acceptance, and the emergency measures become ingrained in the political and social landscape. This state creates a dangerous feedback loop. With each extension of emergency powers, institutions grow stronger and more entrenched, while citizens' capacity to question or resist weakens. The justification for control shifts from responding to a specific crisis to managing the perpetual state of crisis itself. New threats are anticipated or exaggerated to maintain urgency, and normal political debate is sidelined as too risky or unpatriotic in the face of ongoing emergency. The impact on society is profound. Civil liberties that are curtailed during emergencies rarely return in full. Judicial oversight often diminishes. Legislative checks weaken, and executive authority expands unchecked. The fabric of democratic governance frays as emergency logic supplants constitutional principles. People grow accustomed to surveillance, restrictions on assembly, and censorship. Conditions once viewed as intolerable become everyday realities. Moreover, the eternal emergency state breeds a climate of fear and suspicion, undermining social trust and cohesion. Citizens are encouraged to see threats everywhere, and the constant alertness wears down resilience and critical thinking. This environment also fosters polarization, as dissenters or critics are labeled threats themselves, further justifying crackdowns and control. Breaking free from the grip of the eternal emergency state demands vigilance and courage. It requires a collective insistence on transparency, accountability, and the restoration of normal constitutional processes. Civil society, independent media, and legal institutions play crucial roles in exposing attempts to extend emergencies beyond reason and in holding power to account. Public awareness is key. Citizens must recognize that emergencies, by definition, are exceptional and temporary. Accepting the normalization of emergency powers without scrutiny invites permanent authoritarianism disguised as protection. Historical lessons show that unchecked emergency rule can become a tool for oppression and the erosion of freedom. Ultimately, reclaiming freedom means reclaiming the boundaries between crisis and normalcy. It demands resistance to the temptation of endless emergencies and a refusal to let fear dictate governance indefinitely. Only by affirming that emergencies have limits, legal, temporal, and moral, can societies protect the delicate balance between security and liberty. In a world where crises are inevitable but should be temporary, the eternal emergency state stands as a warning. It reminds us that when emergency becomes the norm, freedom becomes the casualty. Our responsibility is clear: to insist on ending emergencies once their purpose has passed, and to ensure that the powers granted in crisis do not become permanent chains. The dependency injection ritual. Imagine being told from the moment you enter the world that your safety, your very survival, depends entirely on a single institution, an institution that promises protection, belonging, and purpose. This message is repeated again and again, so deeply ingrained that it becomes a ritual, a psychological rite of passage. This is what we call the dependency injection ritual, a subtle but powerful conditioning that forges invisible chains binding individuals to controlling powers. At its core, this ritual teaches that safety is not something you cultivate within yourself or your community, but something granted exclusively by the institution's authority. Whether it is the state, a corporation, a religious hierarchy, or another form of centralized control, this institution positions itself as the sole guardian against chaos, danger, and social exclusion. The lesson is clear. To belong, to be secure, you must submit, comply, and depend. This psychological dependence is no accident. It is cultivated deliberately, often beginning in early education, social rituals, media narratives, and cultural traditions. From childhood, we are told that obedience equals protection, that defiance leads to vulnerability, and that the institution's power is benevolent and indispensable. Over time, this creates a mental architecture where freedom and safety appear mutually exclusive. Freedom seems dangerous, and dependence appears comforting. Historically, this ritual has been central to maintaining social order in hierarchical societies. Monarchies, theocracies, and authoritarian regimes have all relied on inculcating this dependency to secure obedience. When people believe their security rests solely in the hands of rulers, they are less likely to question authority or seek alternative structures. The ritual instills fear of abandonment and social isolation, which are among the deepest human anxieties. Psychologically, the dependency injection ritual exploits our innate need for belonging and security. Humans evolved as social animals, dependent on groups for survival. The institution hijacks this primal drive, channeling it into allegiance to itself, rather than to organic communities or personal empowerment. The ritual creates a paradox where dependence becomes a source of comfort, despite simultaneously limiting autonomy and self-determination. Modern manifestations of this ritual are pervasive and sophisticated. Governments promote narratives of protection through surveillance, law enforcement, and social services, encouraging citizens to entrust them with control over personal freedoms in exchange for safety. Corporations sell dependency through consumer products and digital ecosystems, embedding themselves in daily life as indispensable utilities. Religious and ideological institutions offer existential security, promising salvation or identity contingent on submission. This conditioning leads to a collective psychological state where individuals find it unbearable to imagine life outside the institution's framework. The thought of autonomy or rebellion triggers anxiety, uncertainty, and social alienation. The ritual's chains are woven not from physical restraints, but from internalized beliefs so comfortable they are rarely questioned. Yet the consequences of this ritual are profound. It erodes resilience, creativity, and critical thinking. Societies become vulnerable to manipulation as dependence dulls skepticism and encourages passivity. When institutions fail or betray trust, the damage is magnified because people have lost the skills and confidence to protect themselves or build alternative networks. Breaking free from the dependency injection ritual demands courage and conscious effort. It begins with awareness. Recognizing the conditioning and questioning its premises, we must relearn that safety can be co-created through community, personal agency, and mutual aid, not monopolized by any single authority. Reclaiming autonomy means embracing uncertainty and discomfort as necessary steps toward genuine freedom. Building alternative structures that nurture interdependence rather than dependence is key. Empowering decentralized networks, fostering critical education, and cultivating emotional resilience can dissolve the psychological chains forged by the ritual. These actions transform dependency from a prison into a choice, a flexible, dynamic relationship rather than an enforced bond. In a world increasingly dominated by centralized control, understanding the dependency injection ritual reveals how deeply power operates through psychological means. It shows that domination is not only maintained by force, but by consent manufactured through comfort and fear interwoven. True liberation arises when we recognize that belonging and safety are not gifts to be received, but rights to be claimed and nurtured. By dismantling the ritual, we reclaim the power to shape our own lives, communities, and futures, unshackled and authentically free. The narrative migration pattern. In the vast theater of public discourse, where truth competes with spectacle, a subtle choreography unfolds behind the scenes, a deliberate steering of collective attention that ensures no single scandal, injustice, or revelation ever stays in the spotlight long enough to demand meaningful structural change. This is the narrative migration pattern, a calculated movement of focus designed to keep society distracted, fragmented, and ultimately inert. At first glance, the constant churn of news and social media trends might seem like natural chaos, a reflection of an endlessly complex world where countless events vie for attention. But beneath this surface lies a pattern. The careful sequencing of narratives that migrate public focus from one crisis to the next, never allowing critical issues to settle, deepen, or provoke systemic reform. Instead, the spotlight flickers, dances, and drifts, leading the collective gaze away just as pressure begins to build. Why is this pattern so powerful? Because sustained attention is the seedbed for change. When a scandal or revelation lingers in the public consciousness, it fuels outrage, investigation, and demands for accountability. It creates momentum that can topple corrupt systems and empower reformers. But the narrative migration pattern systematically interrupts this momentum, diffusing urgency by introducing new stories, distractions, or manufactured controversies before any meaningful reckoning can occur. Consider the news cycle itself, a relentless conveyor belt of headlines engineered for maximum engagement rather than truth or justice. One moment, the world is gripped by revelations of corruption or abuse. The next, attention is yanked away by a sudden celebrity scandal, geopolitical tension, or viral sensation. These successive waves fragment focus and exhaust emotional reserves, leaving society caught in a whirlwind of shifting outrage that never crystallizes into collective action. This pattern also exploits the psychological limits of human attention. We can only sustain focus on complex issues for so long before fatigue sets in. By steering public consciousness through a curated sequence of topics, those in power ensure that fatigue arrives before the completion of accountability. The cycle then resets, starting anew with a fresh controversy or crisis, endlessly migrating the narrative and dissipating the potential for sustained scrutiny. The consequences are profound. Structural problems, whether political corruption, systemic injustice, or environmental degradation, remain unaddressed because the public is locked in a reactive mode, responding to surface-level shocks rather than deeper truths. Institutions exploit this distraction to maintain the status quo, while activists and truth-seekers struggle to hold attention long enough to force real change. Moreover, this pattern fosters cynicism and apathy. When scandals repeatedly erupt but never lead to reform, people begin to believe that accountability is impossible or meaningless. This erodes trust in media, governance, and social movements alike, weakening the foundations of democracy and civic engagement. Breaking the narrative, migration pattern demands awareness and resistance. It requires recognizing when our attention is being manipulated and learning to hold focus on critical issues despite the noise. It calls for media that prioritizes depth over sensation, and for audiences willing to resist the allure of distraction in favor of sustained engagement. Communities can also create alternative spaces for prolonged dialogue and action, resisting the pressure to move on prematurely. By building networks of solidarity and commitment, they can counter the migratory pull and nurture momentum for meaningful reform. Ultimately, the narrative migration pattern is a strategy of control disguised as chaos. It keeps societies fragmented, distracted, and disengaged, ensuring that power remains unchallenged beneath the shifting spotlight. But knowledge is power. By understanding this pattern, we reclaim our collective gaze, transform fleeting outrage into lasting change, and break free from the endless cycle of distraction. Remember, true transformation begins when attention stays, not migrates, and when voices rise in unison rather than scatter into the wind. Only then can the structures of injustice be truly confronted and dismantled. The Suppression Cascade is a sophisticated and deeply frustrating social dynamic where when damaging truths or inconvenient facts begin to emerge, they rarely get addressed directly. Instead, these truths are swiftly smothered beneath layers of meta-debates, arguments not about the facts themselves, but about the tone of delivery, the timing of revelation, or the supposed motives of the messenger. This cascade of deflection and distraction acts like a smokescreen, effectively suffocating important content under performative debates that focus attention away from what really matters. At its core, the mechanism works by shifting conversations from substantive issues to secondary concerns that are easier to attack or dismiss. Rather than engaging with uncomfortable truths that might challenge power, social norms, or popular narratives, opponents weaponize questions about how the truth was presented. Was the tone too harsh? Was the timing inappropriate? Or was the person revealing the truth politically motivated? These meta-arguments appear legitimate on the surface, giving critics a socially acceptable means to discredit revelations without needing to confront the actual evidence or implications. This cascade is a powerful tool of control because it exploits human tendencies towards social policing and conversational decorum. People naturally care about fairness, civility, and intent in discourse. By framing objections around these meta-issues, suppression feels less like censorship and more like a defense of social harmony or moral integrity. Yet the effect is to divert energy and attention away from critical scrutiny, leaving the core truth buried beneath layers of procedural complaint. A vivid example of this phenomenon can be seen in political scandals, corporate whistleblowing, or social justice movements. When a whistleblower exposes wrongdoing, instead of the focus being on the facts exposed, the conversation quickly pivots to whether the whistleblower was respectful enough, whether the timing was opportunistic, or whether their motives were pure. These discussions, while seemingly valid, often serve as barriers to accountability, frustrating reform efforts, and exhausting public interest before meaningful change can occur. The revelation suppression cascade also thrives in media and online discourse. Social media platforms amplify debates about tone and intent because these are easier to polarize and sensationalize than complex truths. This results in performative outrage cycles, where factions argue over the appropriateness of language or the credibility of individuals, while the underlying facts recede into the background, forgotten or ignored. Psychologically, this mechanism exploits the cognitive overload people face when confronted with complex or threatening information. Meta-arguments provide a simpler, more emotionally manageable target than confronting systemic issues or uncomfortable realities. They channel resistance into surface-level disputes, draining collective energy and patience. The consequences of this cascade are deeply damaging. It erodes trust in public discourse and institutions, as people grow cynical about whether truth can ever be heard or acted upon. It discourages truth-tellers, who face not just opposition, but exhaustion from endless deflections. Most importantly, it enables harmful systems, abuses, and lies to persist unchallenged, shielded by a fog of performative debate. To break the revelation, suppression cascade requires conscious effort from individuals and societies to refocus conversations on substantive content over procedural distractions. This means valuing the courage to speak truth regardless of tone, recognizing the urgency of timing and revealing injustices, and questioning motives without using them as weapons to silence. Media literacy, critical thinking, and patience for complexity are vital tools in resisting this suppression. Ultimately, the cascade exposes how modern discourse can be hijacked to protect power and avoid accountability, not through direct denial, but through strategic diversion. Recognizing this pattern empowers us to demand conversations that prioritize facts and reforms over theatrics and personal attacks. Only by piercing through the layers of meta-arguments can truth break free from its suppression and ignite real change. The revelation suppression cascade is a call to vigilance, an urgent reminder that fighting for truth means resisting the seductive ease of performative debate and demanding substance above all else. The protective buffer myth. The protective buffer myth is a deeply entrenched psychological and social mechanism that shields real power behind layers of intermediaries who are exalted as benevolent guardians. These intermediary figures, whether they be trusted officials, spokespersons, or visible leaders, are portrayed as caring caretakers whose role is to protect the public from chaos, harm, or complexity. This portrayal creates a powerful emotional bond, making any criticism of the true sources of power feel like a betrayal against those very protectors. The result is a reflexive defense that insulates unseen masters from scrutiny, allowing them to manipulate and control with minimal resistance. At its core, this myth works by humanizing and elevating certain figures as buffers between the people and the often opaque, distant centers of power. The intermediaries embody trust, safety, and order, positioning themselves as the essential filters who know best and keep us safe. This framing taps into primal human needs for security and belonging, making it psychologically difficult to question or challenge these figures, even when they act as gatekeepers for questionable agendas. Consider, for example, government officials, corporate executives, or media personalities who serve as the public face of vast systems of control. They are often praised as honest brokers, wise leaders, or selfless servants. When citizens grow skeptical about policies or decisions, the impulse is to defend these protectors rather than investigate the real forces behind the scenes. Criticism gets recast as disloyalty or conspiracy, and dissenters become ostracized for supposedly undermining the safety net. This dynamic effectively creates a psychological shield for the true power holders. By deflecting attention onto intermediaries, the system ensures that accountability is diffused and that direct access to the architects of power remains obscured. It transforms complex structures of control into familiar, personable figures who are easier to trust and harder to criticize. The protective buffer myth also fuels reflexive social and cultural defenses. People develop an almost instinctual urge to protect their caretakers from attack, equating criticism with personal harm or societal collapse. This reflex undermines critical thinking and reinforces loyalty to the established order, even when it no longer serves the public good. The myth becomes a self-sustaining feedback loop, where protectors gain more authority precisely because questioning them feels like betrayal. Historically, this myth has been used to maintain hierarchical power structures. Monarchs ruled through trusted advisors, religious institutions wielded influence via clergy, and modern corporations use spokespersons to humanize faceless entities. In every case, the intermediary acts as a human shield, protecting the hidden centers of power from exposure and resistance. The consequences of the protective buffer myth are profound. It breeds complacency and inhibits transparency, allowing systemic abuses to persist unchecked. When people cannot or will not challenge the protectors, the unseen masters operate freely, consolidating control with little accountability. This dynamic erodes democratic principles and undermines social justice. Breaking the spell of the protective buffer myth requires conscious effort and courage. It means recognizing that intermediaries, no matter how benevolent they appear, are often part of larger systems that must be questioned. It demands cultivating a healthy skepticism, not cynicism, that separates the roles individuals play from the structures they serve. It also involves pushing for greater transparency and direct accountability at all levels of power. In a world increasingly dominated by complex, layered systems, the protective buffer myth remains one of the most effective tools for maintaining control. By exalting caretakers and framing criticism as betrayal, it suppresses dissent and protects unseen masters. But awareness of this myth is the first step toward reclaiming agency, shining light on hidden power, and demanding that protection serve the people, not shield the powerful. Ultimately, the protective buffer myth reveals how trust can be weaponized, how loyalty can become a cage, and how the appearance of care can mask control. To move beyond this myth is to reclaim the right and responsibility to question all layers of power, ensuring that protectors truly protect and that masters are held accountable. The ubiquity illusion framework. In the vast landscape of culture and communication, power does not always announce itself with thunderous proclamations or overt commands. Instead, it often operates through what can be called the ubiquity illusion framework, a subtle, pervasive strategy that seeds control symbols, messages, and narratives across every corner of daily life. These symbols appear in advertisements, memes, fashion, products, entertainment, and social media, creating an environment where a particular worldview feels not only dominant, but utterly inescapable. Through this omnipresence, conformity masquerades as common sense, and resistance begins to feel like isolation. The ubiquity illusion framework thrives on saturation. It is not enough to have a single message or symbol appear occasionally. It must be woven into the very fabric of culture so thoroughly that it seems natural, inevitable, and universal. When control symbols saturate cultural spaces, they shape what we perceive as normal, desirable, and true, often without us realizing the extent of their influence. They infiltrate our unconscious, bending our beliefs and behaviors subtly over time. Consider how advertising does more than sell products. It sells ideas about identity, success, happiness, and belonging. When certain ideals are repeatedly linked to consumption, such as the idea that buying a brand means being attractive or powerful, those ideals become ingrained. The symbolism extends beyond the product itself into memes that circulate social attitudes, fashion trends that signal acceptance, or entertainment that normalizes specific lifestyles. This seamless integration creates a cultural echo chamber where the dominant worldview reverberates endlessly. The power of the ubiquity illusion lies in its ability to disguise control as choice. When a worldview saturates all cultural spaces, individuals come to believe that conforming to it is simply the common sense option. They may feel free, but their freedom is circumscribed by the invisible boundaries of what has been normalized. The illusion is so effective that questioning the dominant narrative often triggers social discomfort, confusion, or even alienation. Historically, regimes and institutions have used versions of this framework to cement ideology. Propaganda posters plastered cities, slogans filled the airwaves, and cultural products glorified certain values or enemies. In the modern digital age, the mechanism has evolved, but remains fundamentally the same. Ubiquitous symbols and messages are engineered to create an environment where dissent seems abnormal and conformity feels instinctive. Social media accelerates this effect exponentially. Algorithms curate content that reinforces dominant worldviews, flooding users with images, jokes, and opinions aligned with prevailing power structures. This virtual ubiquity blurs the line between genuine consensus and manufactured popularity. Memes and trends become vehicles for ideology, spreading with viral speed, embedding control symbols in seemingly trivial but culturally resonant formats. One striking example is how consumer culture embeds ideas of success and identity. From billboard ads to Instagram influencers, messages that equate worth with consumption saturate visual and social spaces. The ubiquity illusion makes it feel natural to measure oneself by material possessions or social media metrics, a worldview carefully constructed and relentlessly reinforced. The danger of this framework is that it narrows the spectrum of acceptable thought and behavior without overt coercion. People internalize the dominant worldview so deeply that alternative perspectives feel foreign or radical. This cultural homogeneity stifles creativity, critical thinking, and meaningful resistance. When conformity wears the guise of common sense, rebellion becomes not just risky, but unfathomable to many. How then can we resist the ubiquity illusion framework? Awareness is the first step. Recognizing the subtle saturation of control symbols helps unravel the invisible threads binding perception and belief. Critical media literacy becomes essential, questioning not just the content, but the context and frequency of messages and whose interests they serve. Cultivating diverse cultural spaces outside the mainstream narrative also offers refuge and resistance. Independent art, alternative media, and marginalized voices create counter-symbols that challenge the illusion of ubiquity. These spaces remind us that what feels like common sense is often a constructed consensus, open to question and change. Personal reflection matters too. We can observe where our beliefs and behaviors align unquestioningly with dominant narratives and ask, is this truly my choice, or have I absorbed it through constant exposure? Such mindfulness breaks the spell of invisibility that the ubiquity illusion casts. In conclusion, the ubiquity illusion framework is a powerful form of control in the modern world, one that operates not by force, but through omnipresence. By seeding symbols and messages into every cultural space, it transforms a particular worldview into the air we breathe, making conformity feel like common sense. But common sense is not immutable. It is shaped by forces we can perceive and resist. Only by shining light on this saturation and reclaiming our capacity for independent thought can we break free from the invisible architecture of control. The cultural world we inhabit is not fixed. It is a landscape we can reshape. Recognizing the ubiquity illusion is the first step toward reclaiming that power. The sacrificial scapegoat ritual. Imagine a society gripped by outrage, a storm of collective anger demanding justice. The people demand consequences for failures, betrayals, or tragedies. But instead of dismantling the roots of the problem, the system offers a ritual, the sacrificial scapegoat. A minor figure is publicly punished, their fall staged as a grand spectacle to satisfy the hunger for accountability. Yet behind this display, the true architects of the systemic failures remain untouched, shielded by layers of power and deception. This ritual is as ancient as civilization itself. Since time immemorial, societies have sought a tangible focus for collective fury, someone to blame, to punish, to cast out. The scapegoat absorbs the blame, bearing the weight of communal frustrations and fears. Their punishment serves a dual purpose: to provide the illusion of justice and to protect the foundations of the system that allowed the harm in the first place. At its core, the sacrificial scapegoat ritual is a psychological and social mechanism that deflects attention and anger away from the powerful and onto a convenient target. The chosen scapegoat is often expendable: low-ranking officials, minor executives, or symbolic representatives, whose public downfall reassures the masses that accountability has been served. Meanwhile, those who design, profit from, or perpetuate the systemic issues remain insulated, their roles obscured by complexity, bureaucracy, or deliberate obfuscation. The power of this ritual lies in its capacity to channel unrest and diffuse potential upheaval. When people witness a visible punishment, their rage is temporarily appeased, reducing the drive to challenge deeper structures. The spectacle of retribution acts as a social balm, restoring a fragile sense of order while preserving the status quo. Psychologically, this ritual exploits our need for narrative closure. Humans crave simple stories of cause and effect, heroes and villains. The scapegoat provides a clear villain onto whom all blame can be projected. This simplification masks the intricate realities of systemic failures, which often involve diffuse responsibility, institutional inertia, and entrenched interests. Historical examples abound. In political scandals, low-level aides are often sacrificed, while higher-ups evade consequences. In corporate collapses, mid-tier managers might face public disgrace, while CEOs and board members walk away unscathed. Even in social crises, symbolic figures are cast out to placate communal anger, while structural inequalities persist unchallenged. This ritual also reinforces existing power dynamics. By controlling who becomes the scapegoat, elites manipulate public perception, shaping the boundaries of acceptable dissent and directing focus away from themselves. It's a form of social venting engineered to maintain dominance under the guise of justice. Modern media amplifies the spectacle of scapegoating, turning trials and public shaming into mass entertainment. This spectacle distracts and desensitizes audiences, normalizing the idea that justice is about visible punishment rather than systemic change. It encourages passivity, fostering the belief that the problem is solved once the scapegoat falls. However, the real cost of the sacrificial scapegoat ritual is profound. It perpetuates cycles of injustice by leaving root causes unaddressed. The scapegoat suffers devastation, loss of reputation, livelihood, and often freedom, while the systemic architects continue their work unimpeded. This imbalance erodes trust in institutions and fuels cynicism about true accountability. Breaking this ritual requires deep structural transparency and courage. It demands moving beyond simplistic blame narratives to interrogate complex systems, power relationships, and long-term consequences. Genuine justice calls for holding the powerful accountable, dismantling harmful structures, and empowering communities to reclaim agency. Collective awareness can weaken the ritual's grip. When societies refuse to accept surface-level sacrifices and insist on comprehensive accountability, the cycle of scapegoating can be broken. Empowering investigative journalism, supporting whistleblowers, and fostering civic engagement are crucial steps toward this transformation. In a world rife with systemic challenges, understanding the sacrificial scapegoat ritual exposes how power shields itself behind manufactured punishments. It reminds us that true justice is not spectacle, but substance, not a fall guy, but a dismantling of the very foundations that require scapegoats. Only by refusing to be placated by these rituals can we confront uncomfortable truths, demand real change, and build societies where accountability is shared, transparent, and just. The scapegoat's fall must signal not an end, but a beginning, the start of genuine reckoning and transformation. The meaning erosion funnel. Language is the vessel through which we understand our world, shape our thoughts, and connect with one another. Yet, in an era flooded with noise, the very words we rely on to describe reality are being worn thin. Diluted through misuse, manipulation, and endless repetition. This process is the meaning erosion funnel, a gradual but devastating collapse of language's power that leaves the public mute, confused, and directionless. At its core, the meaning erosion funnel is a slow siphoning of significance from the words that matter most. Words that once carried clear, precise meaning, justice, freedom, truth, love, are stretched, distorted, and redefined until their original essence is obscured or lost altogether. When language becomes elastic and ambiguous, it fails to anchor our experiences or guide our actions. The result is a collective paralysis, where people struggle to articulate what is happening, what is wrong, or what must be done. Why does this erosion occur? Partly, it is the natural evolution of language. But in today's hyper-mediated environment, this evolution is accelerated and weaponized. Political actors, media outlets, and cultural forces deliberately appropriate powerful words, bending their meaning to serve shifting agendas. Terms like freedom may be used to justify contradictory actions, while truth becomes a battlefield for competing narratives. The constant recycling of jargon and buzzwords further strips words of their depth, turning serious concepts into empty slogans. This erosion is compounded by sheer volume. The flood of information, opinion, and propaganda overwhelms clarity. When every event is historic, every policy transformative, and every speech definitive, the impact of these words diminishes. They lose the ability to convey urgency or moral weight, becoming background noise instead of beacons. This overuse dulls emotional resonance and numbs critical engagement. The consequences are profound and far-reaching. Without a shared language grounded in meaning, societies lose the ability to discuss, debate, and solve complex problems. Conversations degrade into noise, misunderstandings multiply, and consensus becomes impossible. This silence is not merely the absence of sound, but a void of understanding, a muting of collective voice that undermines democracy, justice, and progress. Consider how important social movements struggle when their core terms are co-opted or trivialized. Calls for justice are met with platitudes that redefine justice as mere order or compliance. Appeals to truth clash with competing facts that shift like sand. When language fails, hope falters and confusion reigns. The meaning erosion funnel also breeds cynicism and disengagement. When words cannot be trusted to represent reality, people retreat into silence, sarcasm, or apathy. They may feel powerless to change a world where language itself deceives and obfuscates. This deepens social fragmentation, as shared understanding becomes impossible and isolation grows. Reversing this erosion demands deliberate effort. It requires reclaiming language by restoring precision, honesty, and context to the words we use. It means rejecting empty rhetoric and demanding clarity from leaders, media, and each other. Education plays a vital role in fostering critical literacy, equipping individuals to question how language is used and to articulate their own truths with care. Individuals can also nurture meaning in daily life, choosing words thoughtfully, listening deeply, and cultivating spaces for genuine dialogue. By preserving the power of language, we preserve the tools necessary for understanding, empathy, and collective action. In the end, the meaning erosion funnel is a crisis not just of words, but of connection and comprehension. It threatens to leave humanity adrift in a sea of noise without compass or voice. But language is resilient. With conscious stewardship, its power can be restored, enabling us once again to describe reality with clarity, to name injustice boldly, and to inspire change with truth. Remember, words are more than symbols. They are the lifeblood of meaning. When they erode, so too does our ability to grasp the world and shape it. By guarding the integrity of language, we reclaim our collective voice, and with it, the power to move forward. The compassion exploitation loop. The compassion exploitation loop is a deeply manipulative cycle where genuine human kindness and emotional appeals are twisted into tools of control and repression. In this loop, acts of coercion, domination, or repression are cloaked in the language and appearance of compassion, making them seem not only acceptable, but morally necessary. This exploitation of empathy turns resistance into something framed as callous or ungrateful, pressuring individuals and communities into compliance by weaponizing their own desire to be caring and good. At its core, the loop thrives on a perversion of the natural human impulse to help and protect others. Compassion, which should build connection and trust, becomes a mask that hides coercion behind a veil of kindness. For example, a government might justify strict surveillance or harsh policing as acts of protecting citizens or caring for the vulnerable. Corporations might impose exploitative labor conditions under the guise of providing jobs and supporting families. In both cases, emotional appeals soften the harsh realities of repression, making opposition feel not only futile but morally wrong. This dynamic forces people into a moral bind. To question or resist the repressive act is to risk being labeled as selfish, cruel, or lacking empathy. The narrative insists that compliance is the compassionate choice, and dissent is the heartless alternative. This framing isolates critics, undermining their legitimacy and dividing communities by turning empathy into a weapon against those who seek justice or freedom. The compassion exploitation loop also thrives on repetition and social reinforcement. Messaging that equates compliance with kindness is repeated through media, social institutions, and cultural narratives until it becomes internalized. People begin to police their own doubts and fears, suppressing critical thinking in favor of maintaining the comforting illusion that repression is for the greater good. Psychologically, this loop exploits cognitive dissonance and emotional conditioning. When individuals care deeply about being kind and good, they are more likely to accept distorted narratives that align repression with compassion. The emotional discomfort of recognizing coercion clashes with their desire to see themselves as compassionate, leading to rationalizations that perpetuate the cycle. The consequences are profound and far-reaching. The loop enables abuses of power to persist unchecked, as it neutralizes dissent and channels collective energy into self-censorship and compliance. It corrodes genuine empathy by associating it with manipulation and control, leaving people emotionally exhausted and distrustful. Most dangerously, it blurs the line between kindness and cruelty, making it difficult to discern when compassion is authentic and when it is a tool of domination. Breaking the compassion. Exploitation loop demands critical awareness and courage. It requires recognizing when emotional appeals are being used not to heal or protect, but to mask harm and silence opposition. True compassion must be rooted in respect, autonomy, and justice, not in coercion disguised as care. Individuals and societies must reclaim empathy as a force for liberation rather than control, learning to hold space for both kindness and principled resistance. Education, open dialogue, and critical media literacy are essential to expose and dismantle this loop. By questioning narratives that conflate repression with compassion, communities can create environments where empathy supports freedom and accountability rather than subjugation. Ultimately, the compassion exploitation loop reveals how the noblest human emotions can be twisted into instruments of oppression. It challenges us to be vigilant in protecting the integrity of compassion, ensuring it empowers rather than enslaves, heals rather than harms, and uplifts rather than silences. The path forward lies in embracing a compassion that honors truth and justice, rejecting the exploitation of kindness for control, and affirming the right to resist without being branded as heartless. Only then can compassion reclaim its rightful place as a genuine force for human dignity and freedom. The historical reenactment. The historical reenactment syndrome is a powerful and often invisible cycle that traps societies in endless repetitions of conflict. At its core, it transforms complex past events into simplified myths and parables. Stories stripped of nuance, reduced to black and white narratives of good versus evil, us versus them. These myths become the cultural scripts that condition generations to reenact hostilities, often without ever pausing to ask the most critical question: who truly benefits from this ongoing strife? History, in its raw form, is complicated and messy. It involves overlapping motivations, shifting alliances, betrayals, and unintended consequences. But through the lens of the historical reenactment syndrome, these complexities are erased, replaced by tales designed to reinforce group identity, justify grievances, and legitimize future conflicts. The past becomes a tool not for learning, but for mobilizing, fueling emotions, rallying support, and sustaining division. This syndrome thrives because humans have a natural tendency to seek meaning through stories. Simplified historical narratives provide easily digestible explanations for current tensions, framing them as inevitable continuations of ancient wounds. When children grow up hearing that their ancestors were wronged or glorified for fighting a noble cause, these lessons embed deep emotional triggers. Without critical examination, the line between history and mythology blurs, making conflict feel like destiny rather than choice. Political leaders, cultural institutions, and media often play significant roles in perpetuating this syndrome. They highlight selective events, emphasize heroic or villainous figures, and repeat phrases that stoke collective memory. In doing so, they create a shared script where opposing sides see themselves locked in a cycle of revenge and defense, each convinced of moral superiority. This scripting discourages questioning because to do so would threaten group cohesion and identity. A poignant example can be found in many long-standing regional or ethnic conflicts worldwide, where historical grievances are central to contemporary narratives. The historical reenactment syndrome ensures that rather than resolving differences, communities remain trapped in a ritualistic replay of past hostilities. Every new generation inherits the burden of inherited trauma and inherited enemies, often without the tools or freedom to break the cycle. The consequences of this syndrome are devastating. It not only perpetuates violence and mistrust, but also stifles progress, dialogue, and reconciliation. It narrows collective imagination, making alternative futures, peace, cooperation, mutual understanding, seem impossible or even betrayal. Societies become prisoners of their own historical myths, reenacting tragedies scripted long before their time. Breaking free from the historical reenactment syndrome demands conscious, courageous effort. It requires revisiting history with critical eyes, embracing its complexities, and exposing the manipulations behind simplified myths. Education plays a crucial role, teaching multiple perspectives, fostering empathy, and encouraging inquiry over indoctrination. It also means creating spaces for dialogue where groups can confront their shared past honestly and collaboratively, without falling into predetermined roles. Moreover, questioning who benefits from perpetuated hostilities is essential. Often, unseen powers profit, politicians who gain from division, industries that thrive on conflict, or external actors who manipulate narratives for strategic advantage. Recognizing these interests helps untangle genuine grievances from manufactured ones and opens pathways to healing. The historical reenactment syndrome reminds us that history is not destiny. It is a narrative shaped by those who tell it, and thus it can be reshaped by those who listen critically. By refusing to accept simplified parables, and by questioning the scripts handed down, societies can break the cycle and transform inherited pain into understanding, and write new stories that prioritize peace over perpetual conflict. In this way, the syndrome serves as both a warning and a call to action, a challenge to confront the myths that bind us, and to reclaim history as a tool for liberation rather than repetition. Only then can we move beyond reenactment toward true resolution and shared futures. The perception saturation grid. In the complex battlefield of the modern mind, a phenomenon known as the perception saturation grid silently yet effectively reshapes reality itself. This grid is not a physical construct, but a cognitive labyrinth where multiple conflicting narratives are injected simultaneously into the collective consciousness. The result is a saturation of perception so dense, so chaotic, that discerning truth from illusion becomes not only difficult, but overwhelmingly exhausting. In this tangled web of stories and claims, surrender, passive acceptance, or disengagement often emerges as the path of least resistance. The perception saturation grid operates through the sheer volume and velocity of information. In an era dominated by digital media, social platforms, 24-hour news cycles, and instant communication, people are bombarded with a relentless flood of narratives. Each narrative competes for attention, often contradicting others, yet all demanding to be taken seriously. Facts blend with opinions, truth mixes with falsehood, and every perspective claims its own version of reality. This saturation is not accidental. It is strategically engineered. The more narratives coexist, especially if they conflict, the harder it becomes for any individual to untangle them and find a coherent understanding. This cognitive overload creates a mental gridlock. Rather than empowering critical thinking, the flood of competing stories wears down the mind, producing confusion, frustration, and ultimately fatigue. As the grid saturates perception, an unsettling phenomenon occurs. The collective psyche begins to surrender. It is easier to disengage, to accept the swirl of contradictions without resolution than to fight through the noise for clarity. This surrender does not always manifest as explicit resignation, but often as apathy, cynicism, or the retreat into echo chambers where simpler, singular narratives prevail. The consequences of the perception saturation grid are profound. Societies reliant on informed citizenry for democratic decision-making find themselves undermined. When people cannot confidently identify facts or shared realities, meaningful discourse falters, public trust erodes, polarizations deepen, and social cohesion frays. The very fabric of communal understanding is strained by the saturation of competing narratives. Historical and contemporary examples illustrate this dynamic. Consider political discourse during contentious elections, where multiple competing narratives, some factual, others misleading, bombard the public. Citizens face a barrage of conflicting claims about candidates, policies, and events. The overload causes many to disengage or retreat into partisan bubbles, where the complexity of the grid is reduced to manageable simplicity. Similarly, during major crises, such as pandemics or conflicts, the perception saturation grid expands. Official statements, expert opinions, conspiracy theories, and social commentary intertwine in a dizzying maze. The public struggles to navigate between genuine guidance and misinformation. The overwhelming flow sometimes leads to paralysis or blind trust in authorities, regardless of credibility. The perception saturation grid also exploits psychological vulnerabilities. The human brain seeks patterns and closure. When bombarded with dissonant inputs, it may default to cognitive shortcuts or emotional reactions rather than careful analysis. This vulnerability is leveraged to direct public sentiment, manipulate opinions, and suppress dissent by fracturing shared realities. Resisting the grid requires conscious effort and strategic approaches. Media literacy education is critical, teaching individuals not only to evaluate content critically, but to manage information overload and recognize manipulative tactics. Cultivating patience and mental discipline to step back from the flood, question assumptions, and seek reliable sources is essential. Community engagement can offer anchor points within the grid's chaos. Dialogues grounded in empathy and open-mindedness foster spaces where shared understanding can emerge despite saturation. Encouraging pluralism without fragmentation and consensus without conformity helps rebuild the social trust strained by conflicting narratives. Technology, paradoxically, can both fuel and mitigate the grid. While algorithms amplify competing narratives for engagement, they can also be harnessed to promote verified information and diverse perspectives, if designed with ethical intent and transparency. Ultimately, the perception saturation grid warns of a future where truth becomes a battlefield cluttered with noise and confusion, and where the mind's natural defenses are overwhelmed. It challenges us to cultivate resilience, the ability to discern, to question, and to engage without surrendering to fatigue. In a world saturated with narratives, surrender is not inevitable. Through awareness, education, and community, we can pierce the grid's fog, reclaim clarity, and preserve the vital human capacity to distinguish reality from illusion. The tranquility veil effect. Imagine living in a world where unrest simmers beneath the surface, where discontent brews quietly in hearts and minds, but where the very fabric of daily life is woven with distractions so pleasant, so absorbing, that the urge to revolt never quite takes hold. This is the paradox of the tranquility veil effect. A carefully constructed illusion of freedom and satisfaction so complete that the very idea of rebellion seems not only unnecessary, but even ungrateful or absurd. At its essence, the tranquility veil is a social mechanism designed to pacify dissent through the strategic deployment of comfort, entertainment, and superficial engagement. Rather than confront grievances head-on or address systemic injustices, those in power provide a smokescreen of pleasant diversions, luxuries, media, consumer goods, social rituals that captivate attention and numb critical impulse. The masses become entranced, caught in a web of satisfaction that masks deeper unrest. This effect is subtle but devastatingly effective. Unlike overt oppression, which can provoke resistance through clear boundaries and grievances, the tranquility veil blurs lines and softens edges. Discontent is never fully extinguished, but is continually deferred, diluted, and displaced by waves of pleasurable distractions. The very pleasures that sustain daily life become chains of comfort, binding individuals to a reality they no longer question. Historically, rulers and elites have long recognized the power of distraction as a tool of control. From the Roman emperors bred in circuses, designed to divert public attention from political failures, to modern consumer societies awash in media and entertainment, the principle remains the same: satisfy superficial needs so thoroughly that deeper questions are left unasked. Psychologically, this taps into fundamental human drives. People seek happiness, connection, and meaning. When these needs are superficially met, even imperfectly, they are less inclined to risk upheaval or discomfort. The fear of losing these comforts creates a powerful incentive to accept the status quo, even if it is unjust or limiting. In the digital age, the tranquility veil effect has reached unprecedented heights. Endless streams of content, social media validation, immersive gaming, and curated lifestyles flood our consciousness. The constant stimulation and instant gratification serve as anesthetics, numbing critical faculties and fostering passivity. The illusion of choice and freedom in selecting among distractions further deepens the veil, making dissent seem irrational or self-sabotaging. Yet, beneath this surface calm, tensions remain. Economic inequalities, social injustices, environmental crises all persist and grow, but the veil muffles these realities, casting them as distant problems or personal failures rather than collective challenges. To question or resist is to threaten one's own access to the comforts that define modern life. This effect also cultivates a culture of gratitude toward the very system that enforces limitation. Pleasure becomes a currency of compliance. Complaining or revolting feels like ingratitude, a denial of the gifts provided. This emotional manipulation traps individuals in a paradox, where freedom is celebrated as long as it does not disrupt the tranquility. Breaking through the tranquility veil requires awakening from this induced stupor. It demands recognizing the difference between genuine fulfillment and manufactured distraction. Critical awareness exposes the veil's purpose: to pacify, to placate, and ultimately to preserve control. True freedom lies not in the absence of discomfort, but in the presence of choice, especially the choice to challenge, to question, and to demand better. It requires embracing uncertainty and sacrifice, confronting difficult truths, and reclaiming agency beyond the allure of easy pleasure. Collective awakening can pierce the veil. When communities engage in honest dialogue, nurture meaningful connection, and prioritize shared purpose over superficial satisfaction, the spell of distraction weakens. Social movements that rise not from anger alone, but from a deep yearning for authentic change, embody the antidote to this effect. Understanding the tranquility veil effect reveals how power can be maintained not only by force, but by pleasure, a subtle, seductive dominion over the mind and spirit. It challenges us to look beyond the surface comfort and seek a freedom that is robust, demanding, and real. Only by lifting this veil can society confront its true challenges and forge paths toward justice, equity, and meaningful liberation. The quiet illusion of tranquility must give way to the vibrant noise of authentic human aspiration and collective courage. The grievance magnification lens. In the complex interplay of society and power, emotions are both a source of strength and a tool of manipulation. Among the most potent of these manipulations is the grievance magnification lens, a phenomenon where small personal injuries, minor slights, or localized frustrations are deliberately inflated into vast, overarching conspiracies. This magnification weaponizes resentment, transforming private pain into collective rage that serves the strategic interests of those in control. At first glance, grievances are natural and unavoidable. Every society contains injustices, and every individual experiences hurt. But the danger emerges when these wounds are not allowed to remain personal or proportional, but are instead projected onto a larger stage and distorted. Through rhetoric, media amplification, and social narratives, isolated incidents become symbols of systemic evil, turning nuanced problems into simplified, incendiary dogma. Why does this happen? Because rage is a powerful motivator, far more potent than quiet dissatisfaction. By enlarging grievances, actors in power can channel diffuse frustration into targeted anger. This anger is easier to direct, manipulate, and control. Instead of individuals wrestling privately with complex feelings, they are rallied into collective movements, sometimes righteous, sometimes destructive, aligned with agendas that may have little to do with their original grievances. The process works like a lens in a microscope, taking a small detail and enlarging it until it dominates the entire field of view. Social media platforms, partisan media, and political operatives play key roles in this magnification. They highlight the most provocative elements, encourage echo chambers, and frame narratives that emphasize betrayal, victimhood, and conspiratorial intent. This framing not only amplifies resentment, but obscures nuance, painting adversaries as monstrous and solutions as zero-sum. The consequences of this lens are profound and often dangerous. Private frustrations, which might otherwise lead to constructive dialogue or modest reforms, are transformed into sweeping social movements fueled by rage and suspicion. This can fracture societies, deepen polarization, and even incite violence. The original grievances, sometimes legitimate but limited in scope, become overshadowed by the scale of the outrage they inspire. Moreover, the grievance magnification lens serves those who benefit from division and chaos. By stoking collective rage in chosen directions, power structures can distract from other issues, justify authoritarian measures, or weaken opposition through fragmentation. The public's attention is drawn away from systemic failures and toward manufactured enemies. Real-world examples abound. Minor policy changes become evidence of vast conspiracies. Isolated incidents of corruption are cast as proof of an all-encompassing evil cabal. Cultural disagreements become battles for survival. In each case, the magnified grievance eclipses the complexity of reality, simplifying the narrative into a weaponized story of us versus them. To resist the corrosive effects of this lens, awareness is essential. Recognizing when grievances are being magnified beyond their true scale helps individuals retain perspective and avoid being swept into manipulative rage. Critical thinking, media literacy, and empathy become vital tools, enabling people to separate genuine injustice from exaggerated narratives and to seek dialogue over division. Communities can also foster spaces for honest conversation and healing, preventing small injuries from festering into destructive resentments. By addressing grievances directly and proportionately, societies can build resilience against manipulation. Ultimately, the grievance magnification lens is a mechanism that exploits human emotion to reshape social realities. It turns pain into a weapon and frustration into fuel for agendas not always aligned with the public good. But knowledge is the antidote. By seeing through the magnification, reclaiming nuance, and honoring true grievances without distortion, we can heal divisions and reclaim control over our collective anger. Remember, rage magnified becomes a firestorm, uncontrolled and consuming. But when held with care and clarity, grievance becomes the seed for justice, growth, and genuine change. The Destiny Engineering Plot. The Destiny Engineering Plot is a powerful psychological and social manipulation that convinces people to accept existing power structures not merely as inevitable, but as the sole pathway to a meaningful and purposeful future. This plot constructs a grand narrative, a sweeping story of destiny and progress, in which submission and compliance are reframed as acts of noble participation rather than coercion or surrender. By embedding individuals within this engineered storyline, resistance becomes not just difficult, but unthinkable, because to rebel would be to reject the very future they have been led to believe in. At the heart of this plot lies the human craving for meaning and belonging. People naturally seek narratives that give their lives significance and direction, stories that place them within a greater cause or historical mission. Those who control the narrative harness this drive by presenting current power systems, governments, corporations, social hierarchies, as essential architects of a brighter tomorrow. This framing paints any challenge to the status quo as threatening chaos or regression, while loyalty is cast as a heroic contribution to an inevitable destiny. The Destiny Engineering Plot often manifests through slogans, education, propaganda, and cultural myths that glorify existing institutions and their leaders as visionary guides, steering society toward progress and salvation. Citizens are made to feel that their personal sacrifices and obedience are part of a larger heroic epic. This emotional investment deepens loyalty, turning submission into a meaningful choice rather than mere obedience. A striking example can be seen in authoritarian regimes or corporate cultures where messaging insists that the present system is the only viable way forward. Alternative visions are dismissed as naive, dangerous, or impossible, framing dissenters as obstacles to collective destiny. This discourages critical thinking and debate, as questioning the system feels like betraying a sacred mission rather than exercising reasoned judgment. Psychologically, this plot exploits the tension between individual autonomy and the need for communal purpose. When people believe their personal agency contributes to a grand design, they willingly relinquish some freedom in exchange for a sense of significance. The plot leverages cognitive biases such as status quo bias and future discounting, making the familiar current power structures appear safer and more desirable than uncertain alternatives. The consequences of the destiny engineering plot are profound. It entrenches existing inequalities and power imbalances by framing them as necessary steps on a preordained path. It stifles innovation, dissent, and alternative futures, locking societies into rigid trajectories. Individuals become cogs in a machine they perceive as noble, sacrificing critical autonomy for the comfort of belonging to a grand narrative. Breaking free from this plot requires cultivating imagination and critical consciousness. It demands questioning the inevitability of present power arrangements and exploring alternative futures with open minds. Education, art, and open dialogue are vital in expanding collective visions beyond engineered destinies, empowering people to envision paths that prioritize justice, equity, and authentic freedom. Ultimately, the destiny engineering plot reveals how the human search for meaning can be harnessed to maintain control. It challenges us to reclaim the power to author our own stories, refusing to accept submission as noble without scrutiny, and daring to imagine futures unbound by engineered inevitabilities. The path toward liberation lies in recognizing that destiny is not a fixed script written by those in power, but a collaborative story we create together, one where meaningful futures emerge from choice, courage, and the refusal to settle for imposed narratives. The Innocence Projection. The Innocence Projection spell is a cunning psychological cloak woven by manipulators to shield themselves from accountability. By wrapping themselves so thoroughly in an image of innocence, whether as victims, saviors, or morally untouchable figures, they create a protective aura that makes any critique feel like a taboo violation. This spell distorts perception, turning objective scrutiny into a forbidden act, and thereby granting manipulators immunity from judgment or consequence. At its essence, this spell exploits the deep human instinct to protect the innocent and to recoil from accusations that seem unfair or cruel. Manipulators present themselves as blameless or benevolent, often emphasizing vulnerability or righteousness to elicit empathy and trust. This carefully crafted persona becomes a psychological barrier. Questioning their motives or actions triggers discomfort, guilt, or social backlash among observers who are conditioned to defend innocence. The power of the Innocence Projection spell lies in its subtlety and persistence. Unlike blatant lies or overt deception, it operates through emotional resonance and social norms. Manipulators may adopt the role of the wronged party, the misunderstood hero, or the altruistic guardian, embedding these images so deeply that dissent appears as cruelty or injustice. This mechanism silences critics, fractures opposition, and manipulates public opinion by shifting focus from facts to feelings. Historical and contemporary examples abound. In political arenas, leaders sometimes portray themselves as victims of conspiracies or persecution to deflect legitimate criticism. In interpersonal dynamics, abusers may cast themselves as caring or misunderstood, making it hard for outsiders to believe accusations. Even corporate entities use this tactic by promoting narratives of ethical commitment, while masking harmful practices. In all cases, the innocence image serves as armor against accountability. This spell also hijacks social and cultural taboos surrounding judgment and blame. Societies often value forgiveness, charity, and protection of the vulnerable. Manipulators weaponize these values, framing scrutiny as moral failing. Calling out misconduct becomes socially risky, as accusers are painted as aggressors, undermining their credibility and isolating them. The psychological impact on observers is profound. The cognitive dissonance between presented innocence and conflicting evidence creates confusion and emotional discomfort. Many choose to resolve this tension by accepting the innocence narrative, suppressing doubts to maintain social harmony or self-image. This dynamic perpetuates cycles of deception and abuse, as manipulators continue unchallenged. Breaking the innocence projection spell requires courage and critical awareness. It demands separating the image presented from the reality of actions, resisting emotional manipulation, and valuing objective evidence over narrative appeal. Societal institutions must foster cultures where questioning is not taboo, but a sign of strength and integrity. Support systems are crucial to empower whistleblowers and victims who challenge these protective facades. In an age saturated with carefully curated images and stories, the innocence projection spell is a potent tool of control. But awareness of this spell is the first step toward dismantling it. Recognizing that innocence claimed is not innocence granted, and that true accountability requires seeing beyond the mask. Ultimately, the innocence projection spell reveals how easily appearances can be weaponized, how societal values can be twisted, and how truth can be hidden in plain sight. To resist it is to reclaim the right to question without fear, to seek truth without prejudice, and to ensure that no one remains above judgment simply by the image they project. The Cultural Exhaustion Program. In the vibrant and chaotic realm of culture, a subtle but devastating mechanism operates silently, reshaping not just what we think about, but how we think. This mechanism is the Cultural Exhaustion Program, a deliberate overloading of cultural spaces with trivial controversies and distractions designed to drown out genuine critique and critical thought. In this storm of endless noise, the energy and will to care, to question, or to act are systematically drained, leaving society fatigued, fragmented, and disengaged. The Cultural Exhaustion Program is not an accident of modern media or social interaction. It is a structural condition, amplified by the speed and scale of digital communication. Everyday culture is flooded with countless debates over issues that often seem urgent, but, upon closer inspection, lack substantive impact. These controversies, from celebrity scandals to viral social media disputes, are endlessly amplified, consuming attention that could be directed toward deeper systemic problems. This saturation serves a calculated purpose. By turning attention toward the trivial and sensational, the program diverts focus from sustained critique of entrenched power structures and critical societal challenges. Genuine calls for justice, reform, or accountability are swallowed in a sea of distractions that, while appearing vibrant and participatory, actually sap the collective capacity for meaningful engagement. Consider the way social media platforms thrive on controversy. Algorithms prioritize content that provokes outrage or emotional reaction, regardless of its substantive value. This dynamic creates a culture where outrage is commodified, and public attention is a currency spent on fleeting battles over surface issues. As a result, the public becomes caught in an endless loop of reacting, rather than reflecting, commenting rather than organizing. Historically, similar patterns can be observed in periods where ruling powers sought to maintain control by fragmenting opposition through manufactured or exaggerated controversies. When people are exhausted by constant conflict over minor issues, their capacity to mount coherent resistance diminishes. The Cultural Exhaustion Program functions as a modern, digital age extension of this age-old tactic. The impact on society is profound. Fatigue induced by perpetual trivial conflict weakens social movements, disperses focus, and breeds cynicism. People grow skeptical not just of media, but of activism itself, questioning whether change is possible or worth the effort. This weariness becomes fertile ground for apathy, disengagement, and ultimately the preservation of the status quo. Examples abound. Complex issues like economic inequality, climate change, systemic racism, or political corruption are often overshadowed by viral controversies over celebrity behavior, internet memes, or partisan sound bites. The cultural conversation becomes fragmented into countless micro-battles, none sustained long enough to generate lasting impact. Even well-intentioned activism can be caught in this exhaustion cycle. Movements may find their energy consumed by internal disputes, identity politics disputes, or performative gestures amplified online but disconnected from structural change. The constant push to keep up with trending topics leaves little room for the deep, sustained work that meaningful transformation demands. Breaking free from the cultural exhaustion program requires both individual and collective strategies. Awareness is the first step, recognizing when attention is being hijacked by distraction rather than guided towards substance. Media literacy and critical consumption empower individuals to filter noise and prioritize meaningful engagement. Communities and movements must focus on clarity and cohesion, resisting the pull of every peripheral controversy. Building resilience means developing the patience and discipline to concentrate energy on core issues, even in the face of overwhelming distractions. Long-term strategies that balance visibility with depth are essential. Moreover, platforms and creators bear responsibility. Ethical media practices and algorithms that reward depth over outrage could counteract exhaustion. Elevating voices and stories that foster understanding rather than division helps rebuild cultural spaces conducive to genuine critique. Ultimately, the cultural exhaustion program is a reminder of how power can wield distraction as a tool of control. By flooding culture with trivialities, it drains the life from critique and dulls the collective will to challenge injustice. But exhaustion is not inevitability. Through conscious effort and solidarity, society can reclaim its focus, renew its energy, and revive the spirit of meaningful change. In a world overflowing with noise, the challenge is to find the signal, to resist the fatigue, to care deeply, and to act decisively. Only then can culture become not a battlefield of exhaustion, but a foundation for justice, creativity, and transformation.